We have with us today a return guest known online as Destiny, but also to friends and family as Stephen Bonnell. And we are planning to do a Fieldspotter's guide to some rhetorical strategies or like the manipulative techniques that you've noticed in regards to like debate pervertry, right? I think that's your term for it, that Matt and I have observed with like online gurus and narcissistic pundits in general. But first, just to say congratulations on the election results. America seems to be doing fantastic. And Matt just come back, by the way, from 3 months in your country touring around. So if you need any insights from the common man, he's seen them all.
Thank you so much. That's good. I need an Australian to inform me about what's going on in my country. So, but I guess Americans have opinions about every other country, so it's only fair, huh?
Yeah. Well, I think Americans have opinions about other parts of America. And in talking to people, I realized that I'd been to more parts of the United States in 3 months than most Americans. So there's a lot of prejudice out there, Destiny. People in the Midwest don't like people on the coast, and people in the North have feelings about the South and vice versa. Yeah, I tried to bring some accord. So I tried to resolve those disputes while I was over there.
As like a European, I don't understand that because we're completely united, you know, British, Irish, French, German. There's no divisions there. And intra-country divisions, unheard of. Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, a unified unit of peace and stability. So
that's what I always hear from the neo-Nazi types over here, that we're so divided at home because we don't appeal back to our unified European culture, our European ancestry. So, but you know, what are you going to do?
That's it. Judeo-Christian values, they held it all together. There was, you know, Europe was just one great big happy Christian community back in the day, but it's went to hell with all this liberal woke nonsense. So
true.
That's the way it goes. So I gave both you and Matt homework. I give Matt homework as well. The same homework I give you, Destiny, which was to try and look at like around 5 things which, you know, crop up a lot in the content or stuff that you deal with. And you are covering, one of the things was I saw your coverage of Lex Friedman's recent interview with Zelensky, right? And there was a lot, the paint expression is justified, but there was a lot of overlap in the kind of things you notice and we notice. But I've also seen you, you know, debating with MAGA types, and they're doing things that are a bit different from like Brett Weinstein or Jordan Peterson or this kind of person, a bit different.
You know, part of the motivation for this is that Chris and I are just routinely shocked at the kind of tactics, maneuvers, stratagems that our gurus employ that just seem so fucking obvious. And we can't believe that they actually work. So yeah, hence this kind of like a little bit of list of the worst in terms of giving people a field spotter's guide into techniques that they really should notice when people do this. And I'm sure you've got a similar list of argumentative strategies, debate strategies that people use that shouldn't work, but somehow do.
Yeah, so I guess to start, I think it's kind of funny. There's 2 different ways that you could look at things like this. And unfortunately, we're usually stuck in world 1, where we're looking at like, what are the bare bones things any decent human being should be doing to have a good conversation. That's usually where we're at. I kind of noticed this, I don't know, several months ago. What we really should be advocating for is a much, much, much higher standard. So I actually have like lists of these things that I just keep track of just so for my own sanity. So some of these, I guess I'll draw from like category 2 and category 1. The first one I will give you, okay, is category 2. My community, we've thought of like cute little nicknames for these. I call this one, call it the lazy gardener. So if you are making the big bucks from being an online political pundit, commentator, or whatever you call the legitimate PhD gurus, okay? Because these guys have like PhDs now and they're saying crazy stuff, all right? The thing that I get so triggered when I'm having a conversation with somebody is when they say this stupid, I'm allowed to cuss on this, right?
Yeah.
They say this stupid fucking phrase. They go, I don't want to get into the weeds. why the fuck are we having this conversation if not to get into the weeds? Because remember, the whole point of fucking podcasts and long form content that people love is so that we could get into the weeds, especially when you've got highly educated individuals, or at least people that have spent a lot of time on these subjects, involved and invested in the programs. I don't want to bring on, or listen to Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro or Brett or Eric Weinstein or any of these guys talk if they're not going to get into the weeds. That's the whole reason why they're here. They're experts. Now, there's a world where there's a good faith interpretation where they say, I don't want to get into the weeds because they feel like it's distracting from the main point, or because they feel like it goes over the head of the audience, which can happen. But generally, I don't want to get into the weeds is employed when there's a pesky, factual reality that gets in the way of whatever narrative that you're trying to paint. So almost every single time you hear somebody say, I don't want to get in the weeds, it means that they're underprepared, they don't know what they're talking about, or they were asked to provide a single example, or when they get into the actual technicalities of whatever it is they're discussing, they all of a sudden have nothing to back them up. This usually happens when you ask for an example or an explanation of an underlying thing. So we call this the lazy gardener, and I hate this. I hate it.
Why is it called the lazy gardener? Just out of curiosity.
Well, what good is a gardener if they're not willing to get into the weeds? Wouldn't that be a reason to hire a gardener? Yeah.
So just a point of order, we're going to see probably lots of connections and doubling up between the things that we're mentioning. So I'm just going to mention that my number 5 on my list is, that there's some connections with the thing you're describing. I called it decorative scholarship. And, this is something we see, which is kind of heavy name, citation, technical term dropping, mentioning, alluding to a bunch of things and hinting that there's a great deal of depth there. But, they don't go into it, right? Because it's purely there. It's being mentioned purely for decorative purposes. It does the things that you're describing there, Destiny. But I think what it also does is it suggests this sort of deep learning, this deep scholarship, this deep awareness of all of this information that simply isn't there. They've usually got a pretty superficial understanding of it, and it's really just serving those decorative purposes. My example here, currently researching Peter Thiel, because we're going to cover him next, and he frequently references a philosopher, Stanford philosopher called René Girard, and he's a Foucault-style Jungian, philosopher who I think is pretty useless and obscure in any case. But, Peter can use that to leverage the kind of credibility that's there. But in truth, it's a bit like Jung. It's kind of bullshit, but it's deep. But he just zeroes in on the dumbest and most superficial idea that this philosopher's got, which is that apocalyptic predictions in the Old Testament are going to be predictive of some present day apocalyptic risks and are somehow useful for understanding AI and nuclear war and so on. So he's basically saying Old Testament prophecies are real. Totally superficial and stupid idea, but by doing that kind of name dropping and superficial engagement with this sort of hinting at this background literature, it comes off as profound.
There's a double standard in play whenever people are doing the kind of lazy gardener approach, where often people want to cite specific examples, but in the way that Matt's talking about, like a performative, decorative thing. So you recently, Stephen, were talking to a MAGA guy, and he wanted to reference that there were like FBI or CIA informants in the crowd, right? And because of a report that made, he wanted to say agents in the crowd, but you pointed out, no, the report was talking about informants, which is a very different thing. And then that was presented as, this is a, wordplay technicality. So it's like using, citing things so it gives the impression that you have this knowledge, you've read the report, you've got into the weeds. But if you're pushed on it, you then present it as this is just, you're focusing on a semantic issue that doesn't really, matter to the bigger point. So you kind of get to do it both ways. You can either present your opponent as an unrelenting pedant, but you, on the other hand, are able to just constantly make reference to things that give the impression of depth. So there's a concept in psychology called pseudo-profound bullshit. And it's normally referring to stuff like Deepak Chopra, saying things that actually don't really mean anything, but sound mystical and kind of they're philosophically deep. And this just seems to work really well in the podcast space as well. If you're good with words, if you're good at speaking and referencing research and whatnot, then You just sound like convincing. And like Matt said, the decorative scholarship thing is, if you're an academic, and like there's bad academics as well, there's blowhard academics and all sorts of types in academia, but you can usually tell the difference between someone name dropping to look like very smart versus when this is actually a relevant, like source to provide to illustrate like a point more clearly. So yeah, those two things to me seem like overlapping.
I have one, I guess I can't use this now. It's called show, don't tell. If you've truly read some material and you've understood the material, you shouldn't have to rely on the other person having read the material for them to understand what you're saying. Anytime you are having a conversation with somebody and you're like, oh, you need to read this to understand, and that's it, and you can't explain it, then there's literally no point in you ever bringing it up because you did not read the material. I never believe somebody when they say they've read multiple books on a topic and they throw out a couple authors or a couple book titles, but they can't elaborate on any of the material beyond a quote that they've memorized. That is a huge red flag. And anybody that is like an example of somebody saying like, oh, well, this is why Descartes said that. Okay. But like, that doesn't mean anything. But if you're able to say like, oh, this is why some philosopher or some study said this, and it was interesting because in this, they talked about this particular phenomenon that's well understood here, and they were able to demonstrate that in this study, and that's why this is so interesting. It shows that you've read some important piece of material, that you can reference it appropriately, that you've like assimilated it into your thoughts and into the body of knowledge you have that it's allowed you to arrive at some conclusion, and then you're using it to kind of like demonstrate that. It should be furthering an argument. Yeah, I call this show, don't tell. Anytime somebody immediately says like, oh, well, I am educated in this realm, that should be like a precursor to you demonstrating your level of knowledge. If you have to tell me that you're educated in some particular, field, it sounds like you're doing a really bad job at communicating your education because you have to bring that up as like a source of authority. I could never imagine having an argument in like music where I have to like appeal to like, well, I went to school for this, blah, blah, blah. Like I would just explain the thing because I learned the thing,
Yeah, there's two examples like come to mind of that recently. It's like there was Lex in the interview with Zelensky at the the framing at the end, referencing he'd read 30 books, he's consumed all these and talking about how he's critically appraised them and whatnot.
I've read countless books about this war and the long arc of history that led up to it. I've read Kindle or audiobook about 10 books fully, and then I skimmed about 20 more. And I don't mean books about Zelensky, although he does appear in some of them. I mean books where this conversation was fully in the back of my mind as I'm reading the book.
But in the interview, showing extreme naivety about like the historical and current situation in Ukraine, right? Like, bringing up elections and like kind of repeating fairly bog standard
He sounded like a guy from Twitter. I didn't hear a single question or thought that goes like my knowledge is extensively greater in everything having to do with Russia and Ukraine. And I've read exactly 0 books on Russia and Ukraine. So there's no way that he's read a single one. I don't believe he's read a single one or 10 or 30. There's just no way that he couldn't have asked about any other agreements besides what Zelensky brought up, allude to any facts of the history. Like, yeah, I don't understand what was the necessary education for a single question that was asked here. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah, people do this all the time. It's actually crazy.
Yeah, you're talking about dropping citations for purely performative reasons and not substantive ones. Jordan Peterson is another example. He likes to mention that he's read, was it hundreds, Chris?
200 books 200, on climate change. 200
books on climate change. Why not?
I spent quite a bit of time going through the relevant literature. I read about 200 books on ecological, what would you call it?
I read maybe 200 books on ecological development and economic development, the relationship between the two. And
200 books?
Oh, yeah.
Lex needs to think bigger. He's only said he read 30.
Oh, maybe he should have read it more than just the Communist Manifesto for his debate against Zizek. Remember that? He only read the fucking... What an unbelievable fool. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. But, you're right. I mean, sometimes there's a time and a place, and if you're going to bring something up, then you do it in order to use it in a substantive way to illustrate what you're talking about. I mean, I was just trying to think of an example, and I thought of one of my own because there was this guy, what's his name? I forget his name, but he came up with this idea of luxury beliefs.
Oh, Rob Henderson.
Rob Henderson, right? It's kind of politically valence. It's like an anti-woke thing, right? But there is a core to it which is pretty good. But the thing is, he basically has recycled it, taken it consciously or not, from quite an old psychology paper from the 1980s called Beliefs Are Like Possessions. And I won't reprise it now, but when I bring that up, you can. It takes about 20 or 30 seconds. You can explain the fundamental idea in, rough sketch of that idea in that paper, and show how this luxury beliefs thing is just a variant and a more specific type of that. So it can be done. So that's a substantive citing versus performative citing. Okay, good one. I think we've doubled up a little bit, but great minds think alike. Chris, it's your turn.
One of the things that we see a lot in the gurus that we cover is this use of strategic disclaimers. And this often happens whenever they're presenting themselves, like you were just talking about, that they have this expertise and scientific knowledge. So they'll slip in terms, or they'll add like caveats. And it's like Jordan Peterson or Brett Weinstein discussing, the possibility that hospitals might have harmed more people than they've helped now. They're not saying that's true, but the fact that there's, statistics that point to that.
I suspect if you did these statistics properly, I suspect that medicine, independent of public health, kills more people than it saves. I suspect if you factor in phenomena like the development of superbugs in hospitals, for example, that overall the net consequence of hospitals is negative. Now that's just a guess, but it could easily be wrong, but it also could not be wrong, and that is a good example, that's where my thinking about what we don't know has taken me with regards to the critique of what we do.
The fact that it's even plausible is a stunning.
Well, medical error is the third leading cause of death.
Then, Brett will respond saying, he's advancing conspiracy hypotheses, not theories. And this is just the way that science progresses.
We are not going to advance conspiracy theories. We will advance conspiracy hypotheses.
They can spend 20 or 30 minutes waffling on about a subject, like Peterson did with you, actually, when you were discussing excess deaths, right? And COVID. And then when you said to him, so but you're suggesting the vaccines cause the deaths, right? That's what is the clear inference from what you're saying. But he said, well, no, I don't know. Like, I'm not saying I know, I'm just saying we need to look into it. But in any other sentence, he can kind of switch between the strong version of the claim where it's very clear he's suggesting the vaccines are more dangerous than the illness. And then if pushed, he'll retreat back to, well, I said, I'm not claiming that I know that. And Brett Weinstein and others will do the same thing, where they'll go on this big, long conspiracy. Like he suggested that the October 7th attacks were potentially like a kind of psyop by Goliath, this hidden force to cause disagreements amongst the COVID dissidents, right? Because they were getting too powerful.
There's something that I would call the coalition slicer-dicer working on us. And what it does, let's say that you have a group of people who have found each other and they have come to understand how to interact with each other, and they have established bonds of trust over their growing sense-making surrounding COVID, right? You have the COVID dissidents who are realizing that they're all seeing pieces of the puzzle, and then they pool those pieces and they say, oh my God, here's what the larger puzzle looks like. And they are empowered and they hold meetings and they become an important force on the landscape, because as the population wakes up to the fact that something was done to it that was unholy, these people have all been seen to offer pieces of the truth along the way. That is a very powerful force. That force is fiercely divided over the interpretation of what took place on October 7th in Israel. And this has impacts across the globe. It has impacts on the U.S. presidential election. It has impacts on our understanding of U.S. entanglements abroad generally. And my concern is, divide and conquer is a famously ancient strategy. My guess is we would find the formulation of it in many different traditions. Obviously, Napoleon knew about it. Surely Sun Tzu is going to have things to say about it. But divide and conquer in an information landscape might look very much like an ongoing slicer-dicer operation that simply tears coalitions apart so that they are never capable of making any meaningful change, which is, after all, I think the Goliath's purpose.
It's a very silly conspiracy theory, a very narcissistic one as well, right? But he can then say, No, I'm not saying that's the case, but I've just noticed a lot of things that, don't line up. And it's not like they wouldn't do that kind of thing. And then if his fans are pushed on it, they'll say, well, he didn't say, right, that he was actually doing that. So this like dropping in of strategic disclaimers, and it kind of fits as well with the lack of desire to discuss specific details, because you can say, well, I don't know those actual details, but the overall point is valid. So, but I think this partly relates to people who are trying to present themselves as like scientific authorities or like, kind of guru-ish figures. So I don't know if it comes up as much in the kind of influencer space.
Yeah, definitely. So I have one, I think that maps on pretty clean list. I call it, my name for this is debate edging. And the description I have for this is when you constantly stack descriptive claims one over another that are clearly leading in a certain prescriptive direction, but you never actually verbalize that prescription, causing other people to attack you on a prescriptive claim that you've never made, allowing you to refute their arguments without addressing the obvious implications of what you're saying. So somebody will say, Peterson is relentless at this. Women are really bad in the workplace, and when they have makeup, they distract men, and the only reason women go to work is because they want to sexually appeal to older men and find mates and blah, blah, blah. And you hear all of this, and all of the audience and you are all hearing like, geez, women need to not be in the workplace. But when you try to attack them on that, it's like a phantom prescription. You're like, so you're saying women shouldn't work? You're like, well, I've never said that at all. And then all those fans say, oh, I've never said that at all. He didn't. That's right. He didn't say that. You're totally attacking him for no reason. Kathy, is it Kathy Newman, or am I making that name up?
Kathy Newman. Yeah, she's the
when
reporter.
She debated him, that was a trap that she kept falling into over and over again, because she was trying to attack what were the obvious implications and the implications that all of his fans believe, but he never actually makes the prescriptive claim. And so it's very difficult. You have to ask him like, well, what should we do? Although he'll always say, well, I don't know. He'll always say that, even though the whole audience has already been led there. There's a big like catch. There's a big heuristic, or a klaxon should blare in your mind when this happens. When somebody is constantly doing that, but it only ever goes in one direction and they never provide the counter, that should be a huge indicator that they are bullshitting you, right? There are times when I'm not an expert on anything, and I'll guess, I'm like, I don't know. I don't actually know the science on like this particular thing. It could be that trans people are better at sports, or that trans people are worse at sports. But if somebody says that and then they don't give the other side, right? Like it could be that trans people have a huge advantage. I'm not sure. But it could also be that like the percentage of people that go into sports is so low, and that these people are likely to transition earlier, and maybe the type, whatever. Like if you don't even give the other side, but you only give one side, and you are always caveating to always argue in just one side, then it's bullshit. The caveat isn't there to responsibly tailor the message. The caveat is there so that you never have to defend the obvious conclusion.
Yes. And I think like this is not exactly that, but it does apply. That Hassan interviewed, we covered it on the podcast, the interview with the Houthi pirate guy, right? And it was framed initially very much like, we are talking to this guy because he's involved with this movement.
Bro, are we about to have a Houthi rebel on stream? Yes, brother. What do you mean? Excuse me. Of course I'm about to have a... I'm a journalist, okay? This is journalism.
But then after getting like pushback on it, it was, he's just a young guy from Yemeni. Like he said, that he's not.
Yeah, I mean, we don't even know if he's a Houthi or not personally. Like he didn't say any of that shit. He just said he's a teenager in Yemen.
And then at the same time, there's the argument that the US hasn't prescribed the Houthis at that time as a terrorist organization. So there's like these layers of like kind of retreating from the argument. But like if you watch the initial framing, like the interview that we did, it's very clear. It's being presented that we are interviewing this guy who the media is demonizing because he, is giving us an insight into the Houthis' perspective. But then it's just like, no, I just talked to a Yemen guy about like Luffy and hamburgers. Like other people said he's a pirate, and he mentioned like talking to the captives and all that kind of thing.
Does he know what has happened to any of the crews? Like I heard they tried cat. They having a good time? Are they okay?
He's saying they've all tried khat, including the captain of the ship that he went on. He's saying that the vibes are immaculate.
No fucking way.
He's saying that they win over the crews on these ships, and they like win them over with their charm, and they make them hate America and the US government.
That's so funny.
But that's other people. layering things in. So you can have it both ways, that you're doing the controversial thing, but then you're kind of like, I'm not doing that. And it's kind of like mutually contradictory, but it seems to work. Like you throw like loads of disclaimers and people can just pick the one that suits like the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we see also in the tweeting from these influencers, where they don't actually say the thing, but what they do is they profess, like they're commenting on the wildfires or some major events, and they're saying that they're very confused. They don't understand. Things aren't adding up, but they highly suspect that, and everything about it is leading their followers to make the obvious conclusion. So you can read the replies, and all the replies are like, yeah. Oh my God, the government's covering up the UFOs. The DEI caused the wildfire. You name it, right? The obvious conclusion is clearly seen by all of their followers, but they never said it. They just they just expressed confusion in trying to figure out what's going on here.
Yeah. And it's funny because intuitively we all know what's happening, because like, I'll just do this to other people, right? I used to hang out with you in LA and I know you lived before. Isn't it weird that you've always lived like within like 2 miles of a grade school? Like, isn't that just kind of weird? Like, as soon as you say that, everybody's like, wait, what the fuck do you mean? Like, well, I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying it's kind of weird, Like, that's it. And it's like, everybody knows intuitively. Everybody understands intuitively what's happening. But this fucking thing drives me insane when people do this.
Just asking questions.
On the subject of just asking questions, I've got a close to home example I think applies. And we'll see if you agree or not. So I was listening to the Bridges podcast that you did with Dr. K, right? And we did a 3-part series on Dr. K. Okay. And I understand as well in that context that, that podcast is not really like a challenging debate format, right? It's more a discussion. So there are probably things that you would, might push back in other occasions. But nonetheless, so I was listening to it and I'm more critical of Dr. K, it's fair to say, but he mentioned that like his coaching program, right, which he's very clear in all our contexts, is not therapy. And he mentioned that they have looked at their internal metrics and it gets better results than standard therapy. And he mentioned like they can't release it, it's based on confidential metrics, but he's had conversations with the American Psychiatric Association and he was kind of horrified by how bad their outcomes were. Right now, he also added in then, now they have a clinical subpopulation, so there's other things, right, that make that different. But when I heard that, I was like, right, but you've added in the disclaimers, but what you've also implied is like that your coaching program is as effective, if not much more effective than most other forms of therapy. But you've also added in, that's not what you're claiming. So like if I raise the critique, people will say, oh, but he said, they're dealing with subclinical populations, so we can't really compare the outcomes. But the very strong like implication you get, and from the surrounding conversation with Kyla, where you're talking about, the lack of kind of quality control within American therapy session, is their coaching system is great and super effective and has much better quality control things. But you also get, the disclaimer that I'm not making that claim. So do you think that counts?
I think it's a fair criticism. I feel like mental health and coaching stuff is really weird because it's one of those areas where like therapy as a thing is like, there are strict medical definitions over like what counts as therapy and what doesn't. But then there's also the fact that like when it comes to friends, we all engage in behavior that's like similar-ish to therapy, depending on the type of conversation, but obviously it doesn't carry the same medical things. So it's a hairier area. But I mean, I think that's fair. Like, I think it's pretty fair that anybody coming away from listening to Dr. K talk about his coaching stuff, it probably feels like it's being suggested as superior to therapy, or at the very least something to consider alongside therapy, or if therapy doesn't work for treating similar-ish stuff. I think it's fair to say.
I realize this will be like getting into the weeds on this specific thing, but I think you go fine. I'll condense it to this point. So like,
sure. To be clear, I love getting in the weeds, so go for it.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Okay. So like another example, which I think like lines up with another point that we might talk about, is like, so Mel Gibson was on with Rogan, right? And he said, ivermectin, he said a lot of things, but he also said ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, blue dye number 4 or something. Like, some of his friends took it. 4 of his friends that had stage 4 cancer, very unlucky person with so many stage 4 cancer around, and they all got better, right? They're all cured. And that is, they obviously don't want us to know about the treatments. And him and Rogan, talked about why these things are being suppressed and so on, right? And like, I think a lot of people listening, and maybe a lot of people in your audience would be like, well, that is somebody like making a very stupid claim and relying on anecdotal evidence to support it, right? And inferring there's like a nefarious they that are suppressing information. But on the conversation you have with Dr. K, so Dr. K mentioned him and his wife had a long COVID and cured it with Ayurvedic medicine. He added in a sentence where he was like, no, some people will say reversion to the mean, but then he kind of talked about how, over time, meditation has been proven effective. Things that weren't considered science are now considered science. And he talked about how, we don't have scientific evidence yet, but actually there's a big literature in India around Ayurvedic medicine, that is dismissed by the scientific establishment. So to me, like, it's not as strong a claim, but it's the same like kind of framing whereby you're saying, I had a personal experience and this thing was treated with this, and the medical establishment doesn't want you to know, or they're dismissing this. In his case, he's saying it's because of ethnocentric, like Western, like chauvinism, right? Mm-hmm. But to me, the logic is kind of the same underlying it. Like, take an anecdote, present Western modern medicine as like closed-minded, and then, adding in the strategic claimers to me just gives you like more wiggle room, but doesn't really fundamentally change the logic from like what Mel Gibson and Joe Rogan are doing.
Sure. So I don't want this to be a huge Dr. K defense and attack episode, okay? And I admit, obviously, I'm friendly with him.
This is the weeds. This is the weeds.
No, yeah, you're good. Yeah, I admit I'm friendly with him. So here are the reasons why, I don't want to say I'd give him a pass on this, but why I'm not like as critical as I would be with some people. I think there are a couple big things. So as soon as he said I don't want to misquote it, I don't think it was meditation, something related to Ayurvedic stuff cured their long COVID, which I think is understood now to essentially be like chronic fatigue syndrome, I think, CFS. But whatever long COVID is.
Yeah, a lot of questions around it.
Whatever long COVID is, that was cured. So in my mind, obviously, I'm instantly thinking, correlation, causation, time passes, you get over a thing, whatever you do, possibly could have cured it. Although he does make that concession himself multiple times where he says, like, it's possible that it got better and we're just, not seeing it. Now, obviously, that could just be the caveat, right, that allows him to make the claim while avoiding owning it too much if he gets called out on it. The only reason why I give him a pass I shouldn't say give him a pass, but I won't push as hard, is for two reasons. One is because he is willing to admit that a lot of the Eastern medicine stuff is total bullshit. He's willing to admit that they have serious epistemic problems with the way that they engage in research. So the criticisms are a bit more than just like we're racist. And I think he does admit some shortcomings. I think he accurately identifies some shortcomings of Western research, or of like this concept of like scientism, where people get a little bit too attached to scientific processes for some things, or are a little bit too blindly trusting in them without like auditing them to some extent, which I think can be valid criticisms. Like, I think those criticisms are better than what I normally hear, which is like big pharma doesn't want you to know the answer. Like, I don't think I've heard him say something like that before. If he said that, I would be much more critical. But so I think generally his criticisms are pretty good, and generally his defenses are fairly caveated in a way that I find decently acceptable. But like, I would be foolish to say that nobody ever listens to these and just bites, like a more extreme conclusion than I would say you probably should. So I'm understandable, or I'm sympathetic to the complaints that he is like kind of like weaseling around these things, I guess, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think part of it's definitely whether or not it's a strategic disclaimer or a genuine disclaimer is kind of in the eye of the beholder. And there's a lot of context and previous history that goes into whether or not one judges it one way or the other. We should leave Dr. K, but the final thing I'll mention is it was very interesting to listen to his defense, because he was censored by the American Psychological Association or the clinical organization that administers these things after the incident with the online streaming with the therapy that isn't therapy, with Reckful and the subsequent suicide and so on. And his framing of that was absolutely masterful. Similarly with what you were describing in terms of him emphasizing, Indian medicine's got a lot of problems, traditional medicine isn't scientific enough, and so on. He really leaned into the criticism, embraced it, talked about he's always looking to improve. We're always looking to do things better, that we're exploring new areas of therapy and in an online world, so that there just isn't ground rules for this kind of thing. And eventually got to the point where he framed it as being censored was actually an incredibly positive result. Like actually, you know, in every sense of the word, it was something that he was happy about, he was glad about, and in many ways kind of validated his entire approach. So, you know, Chris and I tend to be cynical bastards, so we
Sure.
read that kind of thing. We read that kind of thing as self-serving, but, you know, I guess someone else could read it differently.
I'll just add, Destiny, just because you probably didn't see that video, that there was the official reprimand, right? Which is most therapists go through their whole life without receiving an official reprimand. It's a relatively, you know, like serious thing to receive, but it is not like removing your license, right? It is.
Yeah, I read the order, the reprimand order, and then I think there's like an 80-page thing that like accompanied it or whatever. Yeah,
that I think that wasn't released publicly, but the summary was. But but in that case, he presented that like, because they allowed him to continue on practicing, they essentially give him, as he described it, a complete clean bill of health for everything. And that's a remarkable way to frame like an official reprimand that goes on your record, and that you need to tell all employers that you've been like officially reprimanded by the organization. Like presenting that as, they said everything is great, like carry on with your new measures, and you're like, well, like that's one way of presenting it. But yeah, so like Matt said, it came across as masterful. But we can move on from Dr. K, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we always go as much into it as you want. I guess the Byron situation was weird because I think it wasn't just the online stuff. I think they actually did eventually got to an actual patient-therapist relationship, right? Did he engage him officially in that capacity?
I don't think I think they debated like the nature of it. He was in contact with him like offline and talking.
Because I thought like online they said it wasn't, but then I don't remember now if they had like a patient-client relationship afterwards that they talked about offline. But I don't remember exactly. But
it was blurred.
But again, well, I mean, if they engaged in an official one, then it would have been blurred. They would have actually had the thing, right? But I don't remember if they actually did that or not. But if not,
I think he didn't ever like officially become his therapist. Yeah. But it's very clear that like Reckful, you know,
viewed him
at times regarded it.
Yeah, I mean, this was interesting aspect of the defense. It was very legalistic, which was that, you know, unless you've officially engaged someone as a therapist, then it's not therapy. It may look like therapy. The other person may treat it like therapy. You know, it may have pretty much everything in common with therapy, but as long as you don't call it therapy, and you know, you can keep emphasizing that you're a therapist and that you have great knowledge and you have a great ability to help this person, but it's not therapy. So,
I'm sure at some point, even if you say it's not, if you're licensed, it would be like, I could get away with that because I don't have a fucking license. But I'm sure if you are licensed, at some point you can't get away with that anymore. You would be considered.
That's almost
our
like
view.
You get reprimanded for blurring the line.
That's not Dr. K's view though. Yeah. Anyway.
So I can link this to another point which is like broader than Dr. K, but I think what we're talking about there in some way is like there's response to criticisms, right? And one way, and I think our view is like Dr. K does this, where it's kind of like presenting the criticism positively, like you're responding positively, but you're kind of dismissing like the core thing, or you're framing it in a very positive way, like a kind of smothering hug, right way. But there's other ways in the same respect, and this is like generally. So Dr. K's way doesn't do this. That presents all critics as bad faith, right? Every critic is fundamentally bad faith if they're going to criticize you strongly. Now, Dr. K also did that because he kind of presented that there's a lot of people online, a lot of, you know, clip chip type people who just want to take you down, and they're trying to get drama. Like you see the influencers almost always do this, right? But you can do it. There seems to be different kinds of strategies. Like you can be like Vosh and talk about, you know, go produce a 3-hour video where you try to recast like the goblin lolly porn defense as like completely logical, right? So you kind of like require critics to go through a 3-hour defense video to respond to it. Or you can make like rebuttals whereby you kind of don't address the nature of the key criticism. You address like some relatively straightforward points or like minor details, but you sidestep the main criticism, and then you say, you know, look, I could go on all day doing this, but I'm gonna leave it there. And the general thing that we've observed is like basically critics fall into two categories, which is either they're classified as obsessive haters if they know the details, right? They're obsessed with you. They just want to like make your life hell or that kind of thing. Or they're not informed enough about your content to properly criticize you. Like they haven't seen the deep lore videos. They don't know your history. So they don't know enough to properly contextualize what you're saying. And it seems there's nowhere in between that where there's like room for good faith criticism.
Okay. Yeah, fuck, we can go back and forth with Dr. Kitchen for a long time. I guess the short thing, the only thing I would say is the thing that I would look for is, was there ever a change in behavior? And if there's a change in behavior that's like measurable, then I could agree. And if there's not, then I'd be like, okay, well, this is just kind of bullshit. Again, the only thing I would say for Dr. K, I don't know how aware you are of like the meta of him on Twitch, but it feels like the initial burst of content that he did was the I guess the meanest way to phrase it is that like you kind of bring somebody on and you basically crack them open until they're like get very emotional, and then like that's the moment you're looking for, and then that's like a big W. It feels like he's moved away almost entirely from that. I haven't seen that on his stream in a long time, so I would say that that's positive. And then I think by virtue of that, he's not engaging people on as personal of a level that puts him in the really weird hairy situations that he was in with Byron, which I think is probably positive as well. So I would say like that's a good step. Now, whether or not, you think he's still unfairly engaging with the criticism or not, I mean, there's still a discussion there, but at least like that behavior has changed, I guess, which I would say is probably a good thing. But yeah,
that is something we noticed as well. Like that there didn't seem to be like we still covered when we covered him. We did stuff that was from a couple of years ago up to like a couple of months previously. Because one thing is that he sometimes presents that he doesn't really or do the Ayurvedic stuff very much or reference it. But I think that's not entirely true. Like in the conversation with you, just for example, again, I'm sorry, it's like it's at the forefront of my mind, but there was one point where you were, or Kyla was bringing up that a lot of people want him to be their therapist, right? And he made the point, well, you guys actually don't know what I'm like as a therapist. I could be, a bad therapist, but I'm just quite charismatic online. And that was good, right? I thought that was a nice self-deprecating kind of comment. But then later, he talked about how he trained the yogic technique for 23 years that increased his insight power and allowed him to like diagnose people that others have been unable to properly get to the issue of. And that aligns with a lot of the stuff that we saw in his content, where he was talking about his Ayurvedic stuff being his kind of superpower that allows him to treat people in an unconventional way. So like, that's the kind of thing where I feel like those two things are in contradiction, that you're a superpowered doctor that's trained like a esoteric yogic technique that gives you the ability to diagnose people very quickly, and relates to like why in the conversations with streamers, he sometimes like nails down very quickly on an interpretation that like with Ludwig, he kind of jumped onto this thing about the death of his father and how like his behaving like a class clown was a coping strategy, but it was all based around like, a 10-minute interaction. And I felt like in that case, you are on the one hand disclaiming that there's anything special, you're just a therapist, nobody knows, but you're also the insight master yogic Ayurvedic guy that can spot the things that normal trained Western medicine people won't.
Sure.
That comes up in a lot of his content, that there's that dichotomy being presented.
I think one of the things that's very frustrating to me, so this is kind of specific to Dr. K, actually it's definitely specific to Dr. K, but it's also broader than that, is you mentioned earlier that critics always fall into one of two camps. They're either haters or they just don't have enough context. And this is true for probably every single thing we've spoken about, and it'll be true probably for everything we talk about. One of the difficulties in conversation, especially when you're dealing with bad faith people, is there are degrees of truth to everything. And sometimes it's even more frustrating. So like a lot of the people that don't like Dr. K are insane haters, and a lot of the people that don't like Dr. K are like just like taking small clips. So where there are good criticisms and where good criticisms could prevail, it ends up being this unhinged criticism, I think I said this to you guys when I invoked my right of response, to where I think there are probably, there must be, right? There are criticisms that you can make of the way that I cover stuff or my content, but I don't think those criticisms are, like, oh, Destiny, he's a pedophile who's pro-genocide. It's like, okay, well, that's not whatever. Or like, I saw this like 5-second clip of you, that I think shows that this is horrible, right? I think these are dumb. These are haters, and they're like out of context things. However, On the flip side, and this is a really common Jordan Peterson defense, it's not fair to say, hey, I watched you have this argument. What's going on? And you're like, well, have you even seen my 15-hour anthology where I go through every single possible counter? Like, if you haven't watched that, then fuck you. Or where you've got people who do have legitimate criticisms of you. Hassan does this a lot. It's so funny. It's where you say like, isn't he the guy that did whatever, right? So let's say one of you guys criticized me and I'm like, aren't these the guys that aren't even American? Or aren't these the guys that were friendly to us sometimes? So it sucks because there's like these areas where sometimes the haters are insane or they don't have the context. And then sometimes, that's just used as an excuse and all of this gets like, mishmashed together. You have to have like actual ways to sort through this to figure out, what's going on. Like I say this, like when people say like, oh, this is out of context, you go, oh, okay, explain the context. Because out of context is just the start. If something's out of context, oh, well, then explain it. And a lot of people won't. And it's like, okay, well, then how is it out of context? So, but yeah.
Yeah, well, it's just the truth of the internet, which everything good gets weaponized. Like, that's kind of what you're talking about. There's a good version, a legitimate version of something, and then there's the weaponized, sketchy way of doing it. Just before we move on, I wanted to underline one point you mentioned there, Destiny, because I think Chris and I fully agree, which is on like checking whether or not there is any hint of the behavior changing. If somebody, makes this response, appears to sort of do the sort of bear hug, lots of love in dealing with the criticism, and then they go on as if that never happened, and they continue doing all exactly the same things that they sort of seemingly very forthrightly and genuinely seem to express regret about and say that this is a definite problem. I'm going to mention Chris Williamson, who was one of the people we sort of criticized in passing. Who was he interviewing, Chris? He was interviewing someone else. Gadsad. But he copped a lot of
friendly fire isn't the right word.
That was the fire. He copped a lot of fire anyway.
Yeah, tweeted at me. I think that guy called me a cuck. I was like, I apologize for the tweet. Like, okay, whatever, dude. Yeah, Jesus. But yeah, not Chris, but the Gadsad guy, I think. Yeah.
Gadsad.
Gadsad. That's Gadsad.
Hi, everybody. It's been a while since I've last hidden under the desk.
But anyway, so he came on to do exercise his right of reply, and we were very mean, and he lashed on to those
in the episode, not in the episode, not in his right to reply.
Yeah. He was extremely polite, extremely nice, and of course it's awkward. So we gave ground and said we were a bit mean or whatever. He expressed a lot of contrition, not contrition, but a lot of. He basically endorsed pretty much all the points that we were making, and Chris has stayed in touch with him and is on very friendly terms. He sends Chris his energy drinks, which he sells,
not as an advertisement, not as an advertisement. Pro bono.
You don't get pro bono. yeah But the thing is, his behavior hasn't changed one iota, not at all. And I don't hate Chris. He's a very pleasant person to talk to, but he's an influencer and he's ambitious and he's going to keep doing the stuff that works for him. And his engagement with our criticism, I think, was purely, I don't know, just a stratagem, really.
I think he would frame that he did incorporate some of it, but nonetheless, if you look at his channel, like there's a lot of the same things that we called out before. So, but like he would regard it that asking critical questions of Eric Weinstein and whatnot, like that he wouldn't have done that before. So we had like a.
Do you think we moved the needle a little bit?
We moved it like this much, but yeah. Anyway,
cool. So where are we?
So we got there one. We're on two.
Yeah. No. What was the name for your catchy second one? You got a catchy name
Debate
for
edging.
Debate edging.
Oh yeah, debate edging. Okay. And then what you guys are mentioning about the source of thing, I call that show don't tell.
Don't tell. Oh yeah, and the lazy gardener. Oh, that one that I was talking about was bad faith critics. That's what we refer to it as. Like everybody's a bad faith critic.
Oh no, I do have that one. It's just called you're being so weird / obsessed end quote. That's what I call that. But that addresses one half of the haters you were talking about. Another one I have here, I call this one the Webster Warrior or the Oxford Offensive. This is when you are arguing a topic that is like decently embedded in an academic field and somebody brings out the fucking dictionary definition of the word. That drives me insane, especially if you're arguing something like in like philosophy or something, right? Say you're doing like moral theory and you're arguing like what non-cognitivism means or what error theory might mean in the context of like ethics. And somebody's like, well, I looked up what error theory, I looked up both of these and it's like, why the fuck are we consulting a dictionary? The dictionary is giving you like the surface level common parlance use of a word. You would never ever consult. You've never taken an exam in school where you like open the dictionary. It's always your biology book or your chemistry book or your history book or your law book or whatever, right?
That's very high school debate team, right? The Western Dictionary defines narcissism as
Yeah.
I've got pushback for both of you at this point, though, a little bit. But it's contextual. It depends on the context. Because we did an episode recently about like where Jordan Peterson was talking with Andrew Huberman, and he made the claim that thought is secularized prayer. Now, that's a high-level idea, Destiny. Your brain might need a bit of time to comprehend it.
Take a moment to process that. Thought is secularized.
Prayer comes first in the evolutionary lineage, then comes thought, right? So you can pray before you can think.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. That seems an outlandish claim on the face of it. But he did mention, he's had this thought, he has some ideas about it, and he said, I have the quote, he said, I've looked at it, it's historic cause, like when did we start to think? That's not so obvious. We started to think of words after we developed the ability to use language. What's that, 150,000 years ago? Maybe it's longer than that, no one really knows it. But thought has its historical origins. The probability that it emerged from something like prayer, as far as I can tell, is 100%. But I'd like at some point, it's complicated, but I'd like to have a discussion with you about that. So it's an idea he had, a thought, the probability is 100%.
We started to think in words after we developed the ability to use language. What's that, 150,000 years? Maybe it's longer than that. No one really knows. But thought has its historical origins. The probability that it emerged from something like prayer, as far as I can tell, is 100%. But I'd like to, at some point, it's complicated, but I'd like to have a discussion with you about that.
So I was talking with someone in our Patreon about that, right? And I think that's, on the face of it, a ridiculous claim. Like, unless you redefine prayer to mean a very unintuitive, non-standard definition, right? Because obviously, just for the logic example, there are plenty of other animals in the non-human lineage which show evidence of having thoughts, and they don't show any evidence of praying, right? Like prayer seems to be reliant on having the ability to think. And on our Patreon, the person was like, well, how do you define prayer, right? Because they were religiously, or not religiously inclined, but they kind of like that kind of philosophical thing. And I was like, well, just take, I just looked up on Google, or took the first thing and was like, look, prayer, the first definition is a kind of like reflective thing directed at a supernatural agent or a god. And you're like, everybody understands what that means. But if you redefine it to a very specific thing where you say like prayer means engaging with unconscious, intuitive, mental activity. And you're like, but that's not what prayer means. So by redefining it like that, you're making an argument based on like semantic confusion from your redefinition, whereas like it kind of relies on the fact that people will mistake the common definition for your technical definition.
So there's two things that I would think of here. So the one thing I would caution is if you've ever got like a cool thought about like, where does language come from, or does thought precede language or whatever, like chances are a thought like that has been thought before by people that have written extensively on it. And be careful thinking that you're like wading into this kind of territory. Like my philosophy background is non-existent. Okay. Now, not from Wikipedia, but the Stanford Wikipedia. Okay. So advanced thought, but like, this sounds like, I'm sure that, what is it? Like, I think rationalism versus empiricism, where the idea is like a rationalist would say that knowledge comes from pure reason and logic that we are a priori granted with no experience of the world. And an empiricist would say that knowledge is only derived through experience of the world. And there's like, I don't even know if I'm sure that debate, what I'm saying is probably settled, and there's probably like more advanced thought. And there are books and books and books on topics like these. So anytime somebody is like getting high on their own, like farts, like talking about stuff like this, I would always like be very cautious. Like, okay, well, what is your engagement with the literature? Because chances are that whatever you're talking about has been written so much more succinctly and has been expanded upon so much by so many different people talking about it. But that doesn't mean you should never talk about it, right? It's okay to I like to talk about philosophy and shit. I'm sure every single thing I've talked about has been endlessly opined on and pontificated on by people that are way more intelligent and researched and read into in those fields than me. The second thing I will say is, so I actually will do this in debates, and it's an easy way to sidestep this stuff. Something that happens is somebody will say something like this. Somebody will say, all sex is rape. And what they're doing is they're drawing from the common understanding of what both these words mean. And it's like, whoa, holy shit. oh my God. And they're like, okay, we'll talk through this. And it's like, well, if you really think about it, you can't consent to anything that you don't have knowledge of, and nobody will know what a dick feels like before it's in their body. So in a way, all sex is rape. And something doesn't feel quite right. And the trick that's happened is somebody is relying on a non-common definition of one of the terms, and they're using that non-common definition to pretend that they're saying something far more profound than they actually are. So when I feel like somebody's playing a word game like that, instead of trying to argue on the definition, whatever bullshit, I'll usually just ask, okay, wait, hold on. You're saying that all prayer precedes thought, right? That prayer comes first. Okay, hold on. What do you mean when you say prayer? And if somebody says like, oh, well, prayer is just like an idea that you have or a hope or some quality, some feeling that you have, then I'll say, okay, fine. Let's define prayer that way. We're not really saying anything profound though, are we? Would anybody even disagree with that? And I find that that's the way to short circuit that argument, because it's like, you're not even saying anything profound. It just feels like you are, because you're relying on the standard common parlance understanding of these terms that you're redefining in a unique way that removes all of the profoundness from your statement.
That's exactly it. Like, I actually brought that up in the conversation with a person. Like, if you redefine it in the way that it means, like the kind of thing you're talking about, it's a banal truism, right? That like before you have deep self-conscious reflective mental processes, you have more unreflective ones. And you're like, well, yes, but everyone agrees that. But just to mention as well, just to add a defense for myself, as a self-interested one, in the case with Peterson specifically and prayer, my actual academic area of expertise is in the cognitive science of religion. And in that conversation, he was constantly referencing to Dawkins. Like, Dr. Dawkins does not know the literature on cultural evolution and the scientific study of religion. If he did, he would know, how out of his depth he is.
I know the literature on the history of religious ideas. I see how these ideas have battled across millennia in a manner that is very reminiscent to me of the same sort of claim that Dr. Dawkins is putting forward with regards to meme. I know that literature. Dr. Dawkins doesn't know that literature. And it's very difficult for me to communicate from within the confines of that literature because it's extensive and deep.
I know that literature. That's like my research area. And Peterson is still a waffly, like, he's just giving what you talked about, his kind of like philosophical, intuitive insights. It's not deeper than that, but he's referencing the fact that he knows that literature as a kind of like performative, like show of strength that you can't argue against. But in my case, I actually know the literature. So I'm like, no, like that does not support what you want to argue here. And the other example that came to me was Vosh debating with, I think it was a philosophy professor,
Dr. Broad or Board or something. I know who you're talking about, yeah.
About water, right? And he's like, actually, the philosophy professor was talking that people have the concept of water, even if they don't know the chemical like definition of H2O. And he was saying, well, actually, they didn't call it water. They called it aqua because it was the, Spanish word or whatever.
Maybe we could agree that water is H2O. That was true even before we knew about chemistry. That was the definition of water before anybody knew anything about chemistry, before we knew about H2O. Back when Aristotle thought water was just an element. Nevertheless, it was H2O.
True.
I'm sorry?
This isn't true.
That water has not always been H2O?
Yeah. All you have to do is cross the Mexican border. And over there, it's aqua. That's H2O, not water.
Aqua means water. Aqua is water.
It's a different term.
Actually, it's agua. It's not aqua, right?
And we're referring to terms and definitions here.
No, I'm referring to water.
Like at that point, it's just like, it is absolutely philosophical semantic. And I mean, in that case, it's not even philosophy. That's just pure sophistry.
I think one of the things I would like to stress to like my audience is that you hear this term a lot, or I don't know if I brought this up last time, but maybe you guys can disagree with me if you feel like I'm misguided here, but like, there's this idea that there is so much research out there and there's so much literature and there's so many positions. You hear this phrase a lot. You can justify any position if you go looking for the right study. And that's like true in a very pedantic, like not true sense. The reality is what I found is that in any given field, in any given established field with an idea that's been argued up for a long time, it's very rare that there are these hugely different studies that don't all coalesce around a single point. There's generally like a couple of really well-regarded authors or a few very landmark studies or like really like looked up to meta-analyses that are published in high-impact journals that will usually say like, okay, like this is about where the research is. Yeah. It's pretty rare that you can go and find a study that demonstrates something of a significantly different magnitude, like meaning that somebody might say, oh, this drug cures this disease and this drug does nothing. Well, there might be two like directions where it's like, this drug does nothing and this drug helps maybe a little bit, right? That might be something you might see in a field. Yeah. It's like research feels like very overwhelming, but it's not really. Like you can just, if you're just willing to Google and like read through stuff, you'd be surprised at how tangible a lot of these fields are, unless you're getting into like really complicated, like medicine stuff or like, you know, neuroscience stuff where it starts to get like really complicated. A lot of that stuff is really accessible. Really good example is I heard Tim Pool cite a study that he said that he heard Jordan Peterson talk about a study where in Sweden, they saw that when women earned more than men, they were more likely to leave them in relationships. And I was really curious. Like, what the fuck is the source of that? I'm really curious. I want to hear about that. That's interesting to me. And I Googled it. And then I found Peterson making that exact same claim. And he said, well, in Sweden, they did a study. Like, okay. And I Googled more and I found the study and it was a study and it didn't say that. It said that women that got jobs in politics that were like elected to positions might have been more likely to leave their husbands than women that didn't win these elected positions. So it's already a particular cohort that was even more narrow than that. But the really fascinating thing is, and this is another thing, okay, I wish more people realize, okay, researchers are not stupid. So when you hear a study that says people that eat French fries are more likely to be fat than people that aren't, and your first thought is, I wonder if they controlled for socioeconomic steps. Yes, they did. I promise you that your immediate assertion that I wonder if they controlled for the most basic covariate ever, they absolutely have thought of that. But not only have they probably thought of that, if you actually read the methodology, sometimes they have really clever ways of dealing with that, which is even more interesting than like the study itself. So in this particular Swedish study, that was one of the hypotheses where they were like, we think that, or one of the ideas is that maybe it's because women who out-earn their husbands are more likely to move on to different partners. And there are two really interesting things that they found when they teased apart other variables. One is they found that the woman was that they looked at the number of men in the next office that the woman moved to see if there was any correlation between her likelihood of leaving her partner, and they found none. But the second thing they found was something that was highly correlated with whether or not they would split apart was how traditional their views were on relationships. With the more traditional the view being, the more likely they were to separate, and that when you got the views to align perfectly, where they both had relatively liberal views on relationships, it disappeared almost completely whether or not the woman would leave the man. So the ironic part is that the conclusion of that study showed the exact opposite of what Peterson and Tim Pool were claiming that study demonstrated. And this should be, I understand that all the disciplines are relatively specific, but this should be something that's close enough to Peterson's field of study that he should absolutely not be making that mistake. Like he shouldn't even be citing his credentials if he can't read what I could understand in 20 minutes. It's a very easy, very basic study to read. So
you almost cannot overstate how incredibly lazy they are. And you know, this goes to what we're saying about this decorative scholarship, decorative citing, and that is all it is. And you know, you've cited the most egregious version of it, where they're not even citing something real, doesn't even exist. But let's say the study did support the thing that they were claiming, right? What the second worst thing that people do is just cherry picking. Like as you know, on any interesting topic has probably been the subject of hundreds of empirical studies. Some of them are high quality, some of them are low quality. You know, some of them are flashy. People pick up on the flashy one. This includes journalists and the rest of us as well. It's not just gurus and influencers. But it's a big red flag when somebody goes, well, this, you know, Huberman does this, Andrew Huberman. He finds some study that, you know, rings his bell and goes, this, you know, and it's this one study changes everything. It's completely, you know, I'm changing my personal health regime, you know, and like anytime someone does that, it shows that they don't really understand how the literature works. As you said, it's not that hard to, like in most empirical fields, a consensus does emerge. Sometimes it's a bit vague, sometimes it's very confident, but there is like a median average thing, you know, these meta-analyses and things get at it. And that's the thing you should be paying attention to, not some random little cherry pick study that rings your bell. Anyway.
And if you're actually reading it, even on the random small ones, because people throw a lot of research under the bus, if you read them, they'll, like good studies will say they're citing to, because a study doesn't have time to study every single thing in the field. They'll usually say, we're investigating this because of, you know, this et al. And this study here, they said this and they said that, and we're working off of this and that. And they'll be citing to other literature. And if they're giving a take that's new or flashy or contrary to the field, not only will they say that, like, oh, we feel like we've demonstrated something unique here, usually in the conclusion, almost always, if these are smaller studies, they'll will say, this could be for a variety of reasons. This would be a really interesting area for future research to expand upon. I have never in my life read a real something that's not off that fucking Medvix or whatever weird preprint shit where people can post fucking anything, right? I've never read a study where somebody comes up to this like crazy novel conclusion, and then in the conclusion, like, we believe we've completely redefined this field because of this one study, you know, N equals 12, where we've proven empirically that iron actually kills your heart and you shouldn't, like, that just never happens, you know?
You're perhaps giving too much credit to academia, just because I'm aware of counter examples that you could cite, but generally speaking, that is like true.
Okay.
The more
maybe I'm lucky.
scientific you go,
to say no, the bigger journals with the bigger researchers. I'm sure there is some dog shit research out there. To be fair, sure there
was a study published in the leading psychology journal that claimed that you could do the manipulation, like the experimental manipulation, after collecting the outcome measure, and the effect would go back in time retroactively and like affect the result, right, across 9 studies. That obviously,
reverse time causation, as stupid as it sounds. So you know, so terrible stuff is published, but yeah.
But the point is well taken, and I would say as well that there's things, Stephen, where people will reference the replication crisis or the issues with, like, you know, low end studies or low quality studies, this kind of thing in academia. But in the way that Matt talked about with decorative scholarship, it's like decorative reference to the replication crisis, because what those people almost always know nothing about is like the methodological reform efforts. If you ask them to describe what's a registered report, I think 99% of them have no idea. They don't understand how to interpret even p-values, right? Which is like a very basic level of knowledge, but they will reference that there is like this crisis of confidence in all research because of this issue. And those are legitimate issues. There's legitimate reform movements. There's the open science movement. There's the whole existence of preprint servers is kind of related to that. And there's lots of good work going on there. Lots of solutions coming as well. And the whole like heterodox media podcast ecosystem, they talk about the problems in academia and whatever. And I never once hear them bring on somebody from that movement to talk about, you know, registered reports or about pre-registration processes or whatnot. So it's all just kind of culture war gristle, right? Like, that's why they care. So in the same way, I was going to bring this up, but like it kind of fits under the selective citation thing, that especially with the conspiracy prone and anti-vax gurus, right? If there is anything official in a study that comes out that they can spin as supporting their narrative, like their anti-vaccine narrative, like there's a study recently came out and Brett Weinstein is claiming it vindicates all his stuff that he claimed about spike from the COVID vaccine spreading to the heart and all this kind of thing, then you completely accept that study uncritically. It's absolutely valid. This confirms everything I've said. But all of the masses of studies that contradict the claims of the anti-vaxxers, that show, you know, there's billions of doses given to people all around the world, and we don't see the effects that you would anticipate if what they said came true, they just dismiss. And I seen this when you were debating some MAGA person, and they were citing statistics. And then in the next sentence, when you were saying, well, but we're, you know, immigration statistics, so where are you? What about the fact that this has went down? And they were like, well, I don't believe. Like, how can you trust statistics? Yeah, so it's like Schrodinger's statistics that when they support you, they're perfectly valid. When the papers give you, you know, like an anti-vax narrative, well, this is legitimate. But all of the counter evidence is just corrupt. You don't believe the official institutions. You think they're going to tell you the truth?
You should force, like, I think the cruelest thing you could do to an American is enforce like some kind of epistemic consistency. I said that if you were a vaccine like skeptic and you thought the mRNA vaccines were rigged and horrible and evil and they were just trying to kill you, you should be banned from taking any type of the like Ozempic semaglutide stuff. You don't get any of it. You don't get any. Why would you trust big pharma then? Now all of a sudden, what is the thing that could clearly help you? And the results are obviously immediately. Oh, fuck you. You don't get any of that shit. Why would you trust them now? That's insane.
Yeah, this is one of the funny inconsistencies with the conspiratorial worldview, where it's completely inconsistent with how people live their lives. Like in a modern society, every time you open a can of baked beans, right, you're trusting like hundreds of strangers that were involved in the production of this thing, not to do some nefarious things to it.
Jordan Peterson failed this test when I asked him about, I said, when you start your car, are you trusting that it's going to start again? He's like, oh, I don't trust that. I've started my car before. And it's like, okay, well, obviously there's a first time you started the car. What a stupid fucking like rejection of what I'm saying. Yeah.
Well, yeah, this actually just, we are talking about, by the way, to return us to the track. So I had my second one was shameless hypocrisy, right? Shameless hypocrisy. And this is kind of that thing, like that MAGA guy. That was actually one of the examples I was going to say, that you can cite statistics and in the next sentence say that you don't trust any statistics, right? And the another example that came up in recent content we looked at was Huberman talking with Jordan Peterson, and they were talking, as they often are, about the moral decay of society. You know, people are, they're sleeping around, they're doing all these things. And he tut-tutted about Californication and how, David Duchovny's character was a sex addict and was giving a bad role model. And where are the adults in the room, Destiny? Like, where are these people that we can look up to?
The show was Californication with David Duchovny. And I realized this show is all about the adults acting like children and the children acting like adults.
Oh yeah, that's a typical Hollywood inversion.
And I thought, this is terrible. Not because I'm some sort of moral avenger or something, but it was sort of like the question I've been asking myself a lot over the last few years is, like, who are the adults in the room? Like, who's actually regulating all this stuff that's happening? Everyone's in disagreement. People are misbehaving in the kind of worst of ways by, not treating each other with respect.
Now, I don't know if you know about Huberman, but he's had a scandal where he was essentially running like an unknown sex harem with 6 women, where he was simultaneously presenting them as being in long-term, exclusive relationships. So they were in a polycule, but they didn't know.
Okay, with 6 women, that's a stronger endorsement for anything the Huberman has ever done.
Yeah, his optimizing.
Okay, go ahead.
The descriptions in the thing, it sounded like a complete nightmare to manage. Like you have to be jumping around a lot and doing all these things. But so the issue isn't whatever his personal life. It's the level of hypocrisy to complain about a fictional TV show, teaching bad values where people are just having casual sex or, treating people for their own gratification. And Huberman had this huge scandal. So Peterson didn't mention this at all. And similarly, when lamenting the lack of adults in the room, while Jordan Peterson and Huberman, especially Jordan Peterson, but also Huberman, are kind of pandering to Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, calling them the X-Men, of the political arena. So it's just that level that they seem absolutely immune from hypocrisy denting them. If I had a big, huge public sex scandal like Huberman, I wouldn't then lament publicly about Californication teaching bad morals, but it doesn't seem to register.
The biggest and most unbelievable application of this was the Tenet media thing.
Oh, yeah.
The 2 big ones were Tim Pool and Dave Rubin each got $5 million. Tim Pool, remember, this guy sells himself as an investigative journalist. If you couldn't even investigate the own fucking scam right in front of your face, why would I ever trust you on your opinion on anything ever? What an insane... I can't imagine if I'd been found to have been taking $5 million from Israel in my Israel-Palestine debates, or $5 million from the Biden administration. That is unbelievable. And not only did he... that was just unreal. He escaped. Yeah. They both escape that without a scratch. Nobody cares. That's insane to me.
I think the common denominator there is that there's a massive disconnect. Things don't add up. There's an inconsistency there, and people should notice it, right? You can't present yourself as being an intrepid investigative journalist that you're really seeing clearly to the bottom of things, and then go, oh, I'm so naive and I didn't know. I just thought it was a present. But it seems that the fans don't really notice the inconsistencies.
Or they just don't care about them. They're good at speaking words that don't mean anything. When people say mainstream media, they don't mean the mainstream media. They mean ABC, NBC, CNN, MSNBC. How many people do you hear ever show me one time this has ever happened where one of these centrists or right wingers go the mainstream media is just completely out of whack? Did you see what Tucker Carlson said? Did you see what, Janine, Mariana, whatever? It's never that. It's always the mainstream media. And then all the people on the left. When people bring up the replication crisis, how many of them talk about issues related to like peer review or anything having to do with statistics? I would be the richest man on the planet if I had $1 every time somebody mixed up the phrase statistically significant with what they actually mean is effect size. People will say statistically significant when they really mean it's just really far away from the measure thing, right? They're like statistically significant just means it's not the null, right? Or right? Anytime somebody brings up the replication crisis, they'll always pretend that it's just like the woke sciences that are impacted by this. When, if I understand this correctly, I think Nature was the one that did a huge survey of all the sciences, and I think chemists, were the ones that reported the biggest issue. And nobody ever talks about the replication crisis, and they're like, we should reevaluate how we do like peer review, or maybe there's not enough money in replicating non-sexy research. It's always like we got to get rid of the woke basket weavers that are ruining everything.
Well, on that note, Destiny, like some of the weakest studies are in the fields that the right wing really love, like evolutionary psychology. This kind of women like to nest, women like to hunt, that kind of thing. It's some of the most incredibly weak research that never replicates, but that is never causes a concern.
None of these guys ever seem to realize all these podcasts that you guys listen to on social issues. You realize that these guys are all practicing essentially for Red Pill. It's gender studies. It's essentially what we're practicing here, or like sociological phenomenon. That's what we're all doing here, right? When we talk about like gay culture and woke culture and all that, this is all like sociological in nature. It's the softest of the sciences, and you're practicing it as like a profession, but making fun of the discipline is so stupid. Yeah,
that seems to relate. Though I will say, Destiny, that I think like the worst replication rates were in the social science fields, but that
for sure,
not the hard sciences, but there were issues, especially like there's Stuart Ritchie has a good book called Science Fictions, which is mostly focused on like medical, bad science, and it's very bad. But in any case, the thing that you're talking about, I had this one that I labeled folkcentrism and heterodoxy, right? And it is that thing that you're talking about where like a Constantine Kissin at trigonometry presents himself as sometimes says that he's like center left, or he's unaffiliated or politically homeless or whatever, but his favorite politician is Nigel Farage. His favorite political pundits are Douglas Murray and Matt Goodwin. Trump is always being misrepresented. Biden is a walking corpse. And it's always the same. Joe Rogan and Elon Musk must be praised, must be like kind of endorsed. And I seen that when you had the conversation with Batya Ungar Sargon, like from Free Press recently, right? And when she was talking to you, initially...
Oh my God, the brainwashing lady, the crazy, evil, yes.
So she framed it initially that you are both disenfranchised like liberals, you're basically on the same team, even though she's a Trump MAGA populist. And in that interview with you, she kind of said, she's not sure if she's for Trump, but she was out kind of like already very clearly promoting Trump. And just recently, for example, I know during that interview, you did what I thought was a very good thing of, highlighting, pushing her and saying, wait,
I think I got upset by the end. I was like, we are not the same at all. Like there's no shot. Yeah, I think because I knew I've heard this game a million times. It's so stupid. Yeah.
But that appeal, right, often works where people like try to emphasize that they're similar. And she recently on the Free Press, Barry Weiss's podcast, suggested that Elon Musk and stuff's promotion of the H-1B visas is actually like a front for the PRC, who have control of Elon Musk because of his economic interests in China. So she's like cooked, right? She's really conspiratorial, like hard MAGA. But in her self-presentation to you, it's like centrism. So there's this thing of like, just folkcentrism and heterodoxy seems rampant. Brett Weinstein still refers to himself as like, what is it, a leftist or progressive. But he did a event like called Rescue the Republic to promote Trump with Russell Brand and, all of the MAGA people. So, yeah.
You've never in your life heard somebody online be like, man, both sides have a lot of problems. So I'm not really sure who I should support. So, it's probably why I'm just probably going to vote for Harris. You've never heard somebody say that ever. People that are always doing that shit, they're always 2016, 2020, 2024 Trump supporters, like or 2020, 2024 Trump supporters every single time, And it's like, man, it's so hard to decide who to vote for. And it's like, oh, really? What do you think about the vaccines? Fake and rigged. Oh, what do you think about the 2020 election? Clearly, mail-in ballots were rigged. Oh, what do you think about Andrew Tate? Clearly political prosecution. Oh, what do you think about Donald Trump's prosecution? Oh, clearly. Oh, okay. So you just happen to align with every single, and they're like, well, no, I think that like gay rights are important. It's like, okay.
Dave Rubin. There was Matt, I'll let you move us along, but I'll just also say that there was a guy, I think it was you talked to him as well as Stephen, that like said he wasn't MAGA, but he had the Trump like limited
The
edition
fucking
shoe
shoes.
in the background, like, you know,
Jesse on
that
fire.
you buy from. So I'm not my guy. I just bought the Trump shoes. You know, it's just a decoration. So, but yeah. So Matt, what have you got? What's next?
All right, moving along. Let's see if you guys notice this one. Now, I realized after I wrote it that it's actually a variant of nut picking. So I'm going to call it unicorn picking, because it's a more extreme version of nut picking. Nut picking, of course, is when you find an extreme position that is held by a very minuscule number of people. You fasten on that because it's an easy object to attack. Unicorn picking is when you invent a position that isn't held by anyone, and so you can slam dunk it. And I looked at Twitter and I saw a tweet from Eric Weinstein, one of our favorites, who did this perfectly. He said, and let me say, this is about the fires in California. Let me say that Los Angeles is every bit as worthy of saving and celebrating as Kiev. I've been to both. I don't know who decided we are supposed to mourn other cities and other nations before our own. For better or worse, this is home. Glory to the city. Let's fight back. There's nobody, no American is saying, let's just worry about Kiev. Who gives a shit about Los Angeles? That's not a position I've ever heard. But Eric has very bravely, beaten this imaginary unicorn into the dust. So have you seen that?
What does that mean?
I don't know if I should say.
So I have one I call this the clown mirror, and this is where every single time you are arguing with an opponent or an adversary or an interlocutor or a conversational partner, whatever you call them, every single time you're having an argument, they can never summarize your position. And conversely, every time you summarize their position, it's never correct because they're worried that you're trapping them. So you might say something along the lines of like, I think that there are issues with the peer review process and the way that money funds research. Okay. And then when they're in the middle of constructing their argument, it's like, okay, well, so yeah, psychology and sociology, these are all bunk sciences. And you even agreed earlier that all of it is fucked anyway. And every single time they summarize a position that you've given, they're like, no, hold on. I didn't say that. I gave this position. They can never recite your position accurately. It's always like they're looking into a fucking clown mirror. And then on the flip side, whenever you try to recite their position to them, and I'll always do this before I attack a position because somebody will give a thing, I'm like, hold on. Okay. So they'll say something like dads are horrible. I fucking hate dads and we got to do something. They're killing our children. We got to get these dads out of their homes. And I'll say something like, okay, just so I can understand. So you're saying that like we need to remove like all fathers from homes? Is that what you're saying? And anytime, this is like a defense mechanism that when I see people like activated over and over again, I think that this person is not operating in good faith. People are very afraid of having you restate their arguments because the emotional feeling they get is, oh, fuck. If he can restate my argument, he's got a knockdown. Fuck me. So every time you try to restate the argument, you're like, okay, so you're saying dad should be removed from the household. Now they begin to endlessly hedge and evolve or mutate is maybe a better, they're like, well, I don't know about all dads, like maybe trans dads or like Chinese fathers or like dads from like the 1800s. They're like, okay, wait, so are you saying like modern dads shouldn't be, or like no matter what you do in this argument, you will never be able to restate their position because they're afraid that if you restate it, you'll be able to knock it down and they'll never be able to accurately restate yours.
Well, speaking for Chris as well, we recognize this. So if someone's talking to Jordan Peterson or Weinstein or any of these people, and they're always talking with friends, right? They're not having a debate like you're like you're having, right? They're talking with a friend. It's a very softball type of discussion, and they'll expound this kind of thing, and then their interlocutor wants to basically yes and them. Right. So if they do kind of summarize their position, give a shorter version of it just so they can sort of jump off there, it's never accurate. No, it's always much more complicated than that. It's always much more nuanced, much more sophisticated. So this is a thing. So I guess my point is it serves not only as a good debating strategy where you can protect yourself from potential criticisms, but I guess they just love the intricacy and the complexity. Like it's like the things they're saying, the thoughts they're having are like fractals that just grow in real time.
You always ask them, bullshit. It's more, try me. People are like, oh, it's really complicated. Okay, well, we're on a 4-hour show, so why don't we expand on this idea instead of feeling like we have to cover 400 fucking topics? How about we get like in depth on one thing? What do you mean it's too complicated to explain? Tell me what the fuck you mean when you say, what was this last thing I saw from Peterson that like the worst fire? Yeah, like the worst fire in your life is a dragon or something. Or what the fuck am I thinking? Or like fire is like an enemy?
Oh,
or what?
yeah, fire's a predator.
What's the category of predator? Bear, eagle, if you're a primate. Fire? Is fire a predator?
No.
Well, it's complicated because a fire kills you.
To be fair, I didn't even watch this whole clip, so maybe he does say something profound.
No.
But in the bit that I watched, it sounded like he was
No.
just trying to make a more general thing about things that do bad things. I was like, okay, well, that's fine, then I get that. But then we're not even saying anything fucking profound at this point. This is just stupid, okay? Yeah, I hate it. It's such a lazy, annoying thing. Yeah.
There's this group of people, they're kind of Peterson orbiters for the most part, called, they don't refer to themselves as this. We refer to them as they're the sense makers. Right, where they really like these kind of like 4-hour podcasts where they discuss honor and beauty and the logic of Plato or whatever, but like it's all like kind of indulgent waffle. There's some stuff in it that's incredible, but they came up with this rule in one of their conversations, and it's something that has like been around in Game B. That's another thing that they talk about, Game B, but it was called the Omega Rule. The Omega principle.
So it's called Rule Omega. If I am operating under Rule Omega, then you recognize that I am the kind of being that is endeavoring to grasp really deep, difficult, distant, nuanced things. Mm-hmm. And by definition, when I'm expressing them to you, they're going to be very hard to understand.
On the face of it, it seems like a reasonable thing because it sounds like what you're asking that people do. So they say like what you should always be looking for is when you listen to the other person's argument is you shouldn't try to tear it down. You should try to look for the nuggets. So even if it's 90% wrong, find the 10% that is correct and kind of build on that, right? So one, that's a terrible heuristic to apply, even if you apply it correctly, right? Because people can just say dumb shit and you kind of say, yeah, well, that's basically right if you take it like this. But the other thing is like, it's essentially asking like for ultimate charity, right? Like as much charity as possible. And you'll hear them invoke about how they're able to have these conversations with people that disagree. And this is, because they're open-minded and whatnot. But that principle is never extended to anybody with strong disagreement. So like you, if you're in those conversations, it's not like Peterson in the debate with you was exercising the Omega Rule, right? And then afterwards, when he talked about the conversation with you, he was like, well, he had the spirit of confrontation and he just wants to be right. And like, if you see Peterson in that discussion, he's very much argumentative, right? Like he's animated about his point, but you're pushing back means that you're not a good faith person. You're just trying to score points. And it's that thing where there are actually relatively innocuous scholars who interact with Peterson. I'm not talking about people that just want, like a big audience, but like kind of his orbiters. And they kind of whitewash him because they don't do what you do or didn't, which was point out, here's the, but are you endorsing these conspiracy theories? Like, do you believe this and that kind of thing? They just studiously avoid those topics and then like spend, an hour and a half talking about like his interpretation of Jungian psychology, but he's constantly linking it, to culture war stuff, but there's no pushback. So they can say, I'm not endorsing his politics. I'm not doing that kind of thing. But you are giving him the kind of intellectual backbone to say he's a serious academic. He's not a culture war pundit when he is fundamentally like a culture war pundit. So yeah, the Omega Rule.
There's a difference between being charitable versus just being wrong, right? Like if I were to look at somebody like Terrence Howard or whatever, right? And he's like 1 + 1 = 3. And it's like, well, if I'm being like really charitable, maybe there's like some like non-Euclidean, like some paralogic. It's like, no, this is not what he's saying, right? When I think of Omega Rule, because I do have friends where we have these types of conversations, usually you're just kind of like, you're helping them along with the strongest versions of their argument while avoiding like the bullshit. And you're kind of like doing this on the go because both of you know that you are like adhering to these maxims of the highest quality conversation possible. Like an example of this might be something along the lines of like, let's say that somebody was driving a car and let's say that they ran over a grandma and it was late at night. If the grandma dies, do you think that person should be charged with a worse crime than if the grandma survives, right? When I'm talking through this and I'm talking to the other person, right, I'm obviously going to say things Like an example I think of like the Omega rule is I'll say things like, okay, we're assuming obviously they're not like drunk or anything like that, and they're not like targeting the grandma because, right, this would be stupid. This would change it like fundamentally. I think this is an example of that charitable construction of like, what is the meat of what you're trying to convey, and then let's like make the best version of that, and then like let's go there so that we can avoid like all of this endless qualification on the sidelines, that we both are charitable enough to each other and arguing in good faith that we don't need to waste time on this, right? We can quickly get over this. But you're absolutely right that when this is applied selectively, it's not being applied at all. You cannot apply this selectively. If you're only doing it to one side, then you're not being charitable. You're just covering for people that you're in ideological congruence with, which is bullshit. So I agree with that 100%. It's the way that this is applied. This is the thing I'm upset about with like Peterson is, and this is why I don't think anything he says now is profound, is because when he wants to try to like argue about like, well, did the Jews really cross the Sinai into Israel? And he's like thinking about this, it's like, okay, well, you know, he's trying to make this like huge argument about can knowledge be a thing that we ever know, or like, what does it mean to say a thing happens? Like, and he's always in the clouds on that, but it's only around things that if he wanted to own the truth of the matter, it would be uncomfortable to his worldview. But man, he has very solid foundation when it comes to climate science, excess deaths in vaccines, what a neo-Marxist, post-fascist, authoritarian, whatever, what it means for a Nazi to be secular. Like on these things, he's on rock solid ground and he knows exactly, you know, where he stands. But whenever it's something that the conclusion would hurt his ideology or worldview, now all of a sudden we get into infinite cloudland, and I hate that.
One of his orbiters is this. He often references, so you'll know who this is if you hear him refer to his orthodox icon carver friend. It's a kind of orthodox, theologically inclined, symbolic guy called Jonathan Pajot. And him and Rod Dreher, the conservative commentator, had like a discussion. And this is fairly standard for them, where they were discussing the UFO sightings as potentially being demons that were pretending to be aliens in order to trick people into like atheism or not believing in God, right? And they linked it to, they referenced some old scholarship and stuff as well.
I feel that we may live, you and I, to see some sort of great religious deception where the UFOs, apparently the aliens, come down and say that God is not real. We made it all up. We're the real deal. Follow us and we'll take you to enlightenment. And here's a weird thing. I found out that, I'm sorry, I'm just going on and on, but it gets weirder.
This is great, Rod.
It gets weirder. I found out that a lot of people in the U.S. government, in intelligence, and military, and certainly in Silicon Valley, they believe the UFO phenomenon is a real thing, but almost none of them believe these are creatures from other planets. They believe these are trans-dimensional beings of some sort.
Well, Alex Jones been saying it for like 30 years.
Isn't it crazy though? I mean,
he's been saying, look, they believe in this. He's like, I don't even know if it's real, but I'm just telling you, the agencies believe that they are trans-dimensional beings, and that they have ways to communicate with them through psychedelics and through different meditation methods, and that, you know, and so it's like now, you know, 30 years down the line with Alex Jones basically, you know, being run out of business, now regular journalists are going to start to talk about it.
I've seen Alex O'Connor, for example, have a like sit down conversation with Jonathan Pajot where they get into, you know, the kind of philosophical weeds about his worldview and whatnot. But I feel like, should you at some point address that he also like endorsed, you know, the aliens pretending, or the demons pretending to be aliens? Like that's part of his worldview, and it's a insane belief, right? But like it would be impolite to bring that up in the conversation because it's going to seem like a gotcha. But it feels to me that like there's a kind of reluctance with people that some people have referred to as like civility porn. If they show that they can sit down and like have a discussion across the thing where they don't shout, they regard that as like, you know, I could sit down and talk with Alex Jones, but like your conversation with Alex Jones showed like, you know, so what? Like if you don't challenge people on things, you can have a very indulgent, nice conversation. Like that shouldn't be news to anyone, but it's often presented as like a virtue. And I think it's only a virtue if you can have those discussions and directly talk about disagreements, about, you know, issues that where you fundamentally disagree and remain like respectful and, you know, talk them. But if you have to avoid them scrupulously, that's like not really praiseworthy. And I think people conflate that like the appearance of civility with the, you know, the kind of fact that like being civil when actually properly debating things, which is a different thing.
Yeah, but servitude versus civility. Yeah. One of the things that drove me the craziest is if I go back and I look at a lot of the conversations I'm having with these conservatives, every single comment, wow, look at how we can come together and have a conversation. Wow, it's so crazy that these two people could talk. Wow, look at us being able to discuss these difficult topics. Like, okay, then discuss them. But then address them. Say something more than that. They're like, where is the, it's not just the fact that we can sit in a room without killing each other.
It's not impressive. Like having these conversations is not a great feat. I mean,
making progress is impressive. Like,
like what you and Chris did at the beginning, Chris made some points about Dr. K, you made some rejoinders, bit of back and forth, didn't want to spend 2 hours going further into it. I left it there, right? You don't get a prize for that. That's good, but
that's normal.
That's normal, right? That's what adults do. Chris, do you want to go next, or is it Jesse's turn? I forget.
I've got one that links to this, that maybe it's on your list as well, which is like prioritizing interpersonal dynamics above all else. And actually, Destiny, I think you've talked about this, that like, you felt that you were in some cases like building bridges, but it was with you interpersonally. Like, people were viewing you that you're a nice guy that can talk with, but that was like not anything to do with like the general thing that like people on the left can be reasonable. It's just like you as an exception to the category. And we've experienced, including with people like Sam Harris, I will say, and the Fifth Column, for example, as well, like you might not know them, but like Michael Moynihan and stuff, that they really put the strong emphasis about what we were just talking about. Like if they're able to sit down and have a friendly conversation, or they get on well with someone, that like this is very important and meaningful. And it kind of speaks to the quality of the other person. And all the time I'm like, I could sit down and have steak with probably some of the worst people in history. And like as long as I wasn't, asking them why they're a serial killer or whatever, maybe serial killers are fine to do that. But like, it's not hard to get on well with people and actually interpersonal situations are often this way. So, Lex Friedman is really guilty of this, but even better, people like Sam Harris seem to prioritize like their interpersonal relationships as being very indicative of whether the person is a legitimate, good quality person, just because you can hang out with them.
That's really interesting to me, because I mean, you guys, I guess, have probably dug into Sam Harris more than I have, I would imagine, because I haven't dug deep into a lot of these people. Just when I come across them, I argue with them. That was one of the few reasons why I actually have a great deal of respect for Sam Harris, but maybe you've seen more than I have, is that it feels like when Sam Harris feels like some shit is crazy or doesn't like a thing a person is saying, like he's not afraid to do that confrontation. And that was one of the things that I it's not necessarily a virtue in and of itself, but I do look at people who are kind of like on an island with a bit more like, like even Bill Maher, I'll be like, oh, okay, Bill Maher says a lot of shit I disagree with, but it's like, okay, at least you're willing to, like, if Bill Maher is like, I don't align cleanly with any side, it's like, that's true. And I'll give him that credit, even if he happens to say something I disagree with. I feel like Harris is similar-ish to that. Like he was willing to walk away from that whole intellectual dark web, which I think he gives a lot of credit for, because fuck, those guys are fucking insane. And I've never seen a group of people get so high on their own presence before my entire life than everybody that was a part of this. So, but I don't know, maybe some people do give too much credence to personal relationships. It's possible, sure.
I would say in the case of Sam, like relatively speaking, he is much better than almost everyone in the IDW sphere about
the
that.
bar is in hell though, so
yeah, but that's the issue. And like there's cases where it took Sam many years to work out that Dave Rubin had a skew. He actually had him on his podcast to kind of let Dave explain that he was, the thing that people were mistaking was his journalistic integrity and objectivity. And that's why they were mistaking him for somebody, that was like a polemical pundit giving softball questions to people. So Sam often does, like over time, go the right way. But like, for example, Majid Nawaz is an absolutely unhinged Alex Jones level conspiracy theorist.
Oh boy. Okay.
And Sam went on and did like an on-stage discussion with him. And he regards that, like, he did push back, but it was kind of what I was talking about. He pushed back, but just enough to kind of keep things. And he regards that as a great success, that like him and Majid, he disagrees with him, but Majid is like, he's beyond RFK Jr. in terms of conspiracism. So you're kind of like, Right, but is it that valuable that you can retain, you know, a personal relationship at the expense of not? Because if he were to criticize strongly Majid publicly, that would break down. So you talked about, you know, people are always talking about MAGA being accepting and all this kind of thing. But as soon as Joe Rogan hinted that he might vote for RFK Jr., there was a collective meltdown, and within 2 days he was backpedaling, right? So it's like there's this pose where there's intellectual openness, but it's very contingent on you interpersonally being nice and like pulling your punches with criticism. Yeah, I think Sam has throughout his history, like, and he's talked about it. Like when we talked to him, he talked about he has this issue about he's not really sure how to calibrate the influence of interpersonal relationships with like public criticism. I think he veers much more towards the generous side.
But to support what Destiny was saying, I mean, it's also true that he is willing to, like, you know, he made that public split with IDW. He was at least willing to be pro-vaccines when all of his buddies there.
He's way better than almost everyone there.
So this is not to take away from that, I think.
Yeah, that interpersonal emphasis was the thing I had. So what about you, Matt?
Well, I'm thinking it's got to be Destiny's turn now. Do you got another one there, Destiny?
I have so many of these. I got one called, you've heard of Occam's razor, I'm sure, right? I have one and I call it Occam's mallet. This is when someone suggests that simply because a party benefited from something or because they had something to gain, because of something else failing, then there must have been some sort of cohesive plot or scheme in order to bring about that particular thing involving, or almost always involving, highly subversive or unethical means. So somebody might look at like a thing happened and this person benefited, and then just construct a whole conspiracy to justify why that particular thing happened. Maybe this could be, in a more macro sense, it's the selective skepticism. A really good example of this, I would say, is if you look at like the different standards that conservatives have for liberals. For conservatives, if they see that a person was like in a single fucking picture, you know, with Epstein, that's enough for them. It's over. But with Donald Trump, there can be phone calls and pictures and flight logs. And it's like, I need to see an actual video of Donald Trump having sex with a child before I believe. And I need to, and the funny thing is that wouldn't be enough. Oh my God, a really funny thing. If you ever bring conservatives on, if you were to ask a conservative today, I haven't gotten to test this because none of them will talk to me because I hate conservatives now, which I fully admit, okay. I'm still willing to talk to them, but I do hate them. Is asking a conservative, can you give me a single way that Donald Trump could die right now where you wouldn't immediately assume it was a conspiracy? They won't be able to name a single thing.
Yeah, okay, I like that. I pay that. You're obviously referring to a type of conspiracism. And, you know, this is something Chris and I, this is one of the themes we keep returning to, which is some of these academic ideas, right? Topics of study in psychology and sociology, things like narcissism, things like conspiracism, cultishness. They are very useful in understanding the spectrum of just bad reasoning, bad thinking, bad argumentation, and unhealthy dynamics. So, yeah,
I agree with it as well, especially the notion around Trump that there's like, it's kind of the uneven distribution of charity thing, right? But applied to various political targets.
Well, Chris, you're talking about, I mean, this is related to the lack of consistency, right? So conspiracists are famous for this, right? They apply this kind of deductive, extremely Baroque kind of logic, but extremely selectively. And also they don't care that sort of aspects of their conspiratorial universe don't match up. You know, there are contradictions in them. So, you know, it is just a very faulty form of reasoning.
It also applies to the double standards, right? Because, you know, I know that we've talked about this, and I think you have, Stephen, as well, that like the double standards around Elon Musk and his open use of a platform to promote like a political agenda is seen as completely valid and not, and like I saw today some story, don't know if it's true, just to highlight, but like that Elon Musk will have a room in the White House. Imagine if during the Biden or whatever administration that like Mark Zuckerberg
or Soros
is giving a room in the White House, like it would be the end of democracy. And yet in Magaland, this kind of thing, you know, it's not that there's no divisions, because there has been criticisms of Elon recently, right? It is likely that there will be divisions, but it's not like Alex Jones has very little issue with Elon Musk when Elon Musk is the embodiment of almost all of the things he's been talking about, brain computer interfaces, electronic cars, all the, everything that he was railing against is kind of embodied with Elon Musk. But because Elon Musk is a MAGA right-wing conspiracy theorist, it's fine. It doesn't matter anymore.
And also something that I hate about this, and I stress this a lot, is that like the right-wing conspiracy theories are like conspiracy theories. There's almost no foundation in fact, or there'll be some fact that they're not even remotely tied to the conclusion. And the left-wing things about like these conspiracies on the right, like they're found in hundreds of hours of like court deposition and testimony, convictions in federal courts, disbarment from people, like public record, like openly admit, like it's not even remotely the same. There is this claim over and over again, and now Zuckerberg is making this claim. And I, along with a lot of other people, beating up on Zuckerberg for it, but there's a more interesting story to tell here. Zuckerberg is saying things like, I was pressured by the White House and the FBI to censor stories. Like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? And he's like, well, we got emails telling us to take some stuff down. I mean, and we didn't for a lot of this because we felt like we deserved to keep it up. It's like, okay, well, so the FBI asked you to do a thing, and then you said no, and like I can still find a lot of this content you're referencing online. So what's the pressure? And now MAGA, in their sophisticated understanding of media, they'll go, well, just the fact that the federal government would even ask you a thing counts as pressure. Do you have any evidence that Biden asserted any of this at all? Because a lot of this was in 2020 under Trump, right? And like, doesn't matter. There was a deep state. It's like, okay, whatever, fine. So the federal government even looks at you. Apparently that counts as pressure. The FBI makes a request. Okay. What about the fact that Mark Zuckerberg said he's removing fact checking from Facebook, among other things, right? Donald Trump in a book said that he would put Zuckerberg in prison for life. Donald Trump on Truth posted publicly that he's looking at big federal prison sentences for everybody if they don't make sure the 2024 election is safer than the last ones. And he calls Zuckerberg out by name. Zuckerberg 180s on all of his Facebook shit, says he's disbanding the team in San Francisco, moving to Austin, says he's getting rid of fact checkers, right? And Donald Trump, when asked at a press conference, do you think that Zuckerberg is responding to your threats? Says yes. This isn't even like, this is like all like, what the fuck?
Wait, Destiny,
yeah.
Destiny, I have a quick question. Did Zuckerberg, was he one of the billionaires that donated $1 million to the inauguration?
Oh, he did.
Okay,
Yeah.
There's another one. All right.
Like, this is crazy. And none of this is conspiracy. This is all open record for all of us to view. We hear about the weaponization of the DOJ. Why the fuck do we have convictions then for Hunter Biden? Why was that David Weiss? Why was that special prosecutor allowed to stay open if it's Biden's DOJ that he's rigging? Why do we have is it the Durham was the FBI? What was the report on Hunter, on Joe Biden's documents, right? Why did Merrick Garland appoint a special prosecutor if it was Biden's DOJ? I thought he controlled it all, right? So all of that lawfare apparently exists, even though it's fucking over Biden and the Democrats a ton. And then on the flip side, Donald Trump is suing pollsters. Yeah. What the fuck? How is that not pressure? But it's so funny when you talk to them. I don't have a name for this one, okay? But if I did, it would be clever, okay? Whenever the federal government under a Democrat does whatever, it's always like, what should they do? What would a good person do? Whenever Donald Trump does it, it's, well, what's in his legal rights to do? And Tim Pool used this defense, okay? This Kremlin-paid fucking un-American treason, a subhuman fucking piece of degenerate shit, okay? When asked about Donald Trump suing pollsters, he said, well, that's Donald Trump's legal right. Fuck you, his legal right. Like, you have all these standards and decorum and morality and ethics for the Democrats, but Donald Trump is okay to do whatever is not illegal?
Elon Musk does the same thing, right? Because he practices lawfare in the exact same way. Like when there's a report that comes out critical about hate speech on X or that kind of thing, he tries punitive lawsuits and shut down, I can't remember, some organization that focused on this because of the cost of defending it. But that is never presented as like chilling free speech. But that is the definition, like designing using your wealth to punitively punish people that dare criticize you. And that just doesn't get brought up. But Russiagate, the Hunter Biden laptop, all of that thing will be endlessly represented. Or, I mean, this was even a stupid thing that wouldn't have done anything. But the opposition research
from Vance, that supposedly came from Iran or whatever. Yeah, was censored off of. Didn't even hear about that from conservatives.
No, and it's a complete non-issue. But if there was consistency, it wouldn't be. So the double standards thing is a consistent bugbear, and it applies across like the gurus that we cover on almost everything, but especially political topics.
I'm going to jump in and move us along. I got one more here. It's a simple one. I'm sure you guys have seen it. Not answering the goddamn question. like Jordan Peterson is classic, obviously, but is he the best though, Chris? Curtis Yarvin, the guy who coined the term red-pilled, dark enlightenment guy. So this is what they do. God. Like they get asked a straightforward question that will clarify what they mean. And they give this long thing, tangential anecdotes, rhetorical sidebars, mentioning this experience they had once in fucking Eastern Europe. And then by the time they've gotten to the end of this ramble around their mind palace, the listeners have forgotten what the question was and don't know whether or not it feels like maybe he's answered something. And then the conversation moves on. So, this is obviously a feature of these incredibly indulgent interviews that happen in our sphere. Do you guys see this too?
Yeah, there's it's at any point in time, your goal is to just say as many buzzwords as possible to kind of get the audience high. So if you ask somebody a critical question, what do you think about the fact that Donald Trump seems to have no problem consulting with foreign leaders? I guess we just don't care about the Logan Act or whatever. That doesn't matter. Donald Trump does a lot of crazy shit about that. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's improper? Should he not do that? Well, it's important to understand that Joe Biden engaged in lawfare with a corrupt DOJ, and it's part of the reason why they sold us things like the vax that I think were causing people to die. And if you watched VAERS, you saw the spike proteins were killing so many people. And it's funny that they care about that. But when it comes to trans kids, and you look at people like Riley Gaines and illegal immigrants, you're just trying to hit on every fucking, it's like a pinball machine of bullshit ideas. And the goal is just every time you open your mouth, you're trying to just drop as many of these things, as many of these member berries for the audience. I remember Leah Thomas. Oh, I remember the spike protein. Oh, and that's the goal with every answer. It's what the fuck are you, can you not answer the question? Yeah, this shit is so annoying.
Weird, but Destiny, we should trade. So do you have another one?
I've got a one that's similar to this. I call it the Braveheart. When someone poses a question about how a person should respond in a situation where it's obvious that the person would need to act in a certain way to protect their interests, but the more privileged debater responds with, personally, I wouldn't do this, instead of acknowledging the need for the affected party to respond and protect their interests in a particular way. So a good example of this might be where you've got somebody cornered into a clearly bad action, okay? Should Donald Trump have called off the rioters earlier on January 6th? Isn't that his job as the president? And there's only one way to answer it. And you immediately begin giving your personal things. They'll go, I think if I was president, yeah, maybe I would have. I didn't ask you if you were president, you dumb motherfucker. I'm asking you. Or you'll say, do you think it's wrong to ignore your mom on Mother's Day? And it's I always try to call my mom on Mother's Day. I didn't ask for your personal story, bro. Answer the question. People do this where they personalize and they try to take some brave answer, or maybe they'll admit a fault. It's that's not what I'm asking. I hate it when people do that.
I'm wondering, does that come up much, Matt? I'm trying to think of examples of people. People do it when they're talking about politics, in our content.
I recently saw some interesting discourse on Andrew Tate, because there's a bit of a schism in the religious paleocon community where, of course, because they're paleocons, a portion of them love Andrew Tate, but some of them are genuine Christians as well, and they've at least got the integrity to go, he's not a good guy. And you see them trying to square this circle of how Andrew Tate can be a brother in Christ as well as doing the things that he does. And I see the same kind of, I think what you're describing is this obfuscation. It's just obfuscating and dithering around because you can't answer the question. You can't really address it.
I've got one more that was the kind of top of my list, not the most important, but it comes up, and I realize this is a subjective judgment, but I genuinely think it's true that whenever we are looking at the guru people and the way that they behave, oftentimes the main emotion I get is that would invoke shame in me. So if I was to engage in that level of hypocrisy or this level of obfuscation, I would feel shamed about it. Or profiteering. For example, Jordan Peterson reading out, this is an advertisement granted, but he was hawking on the Daily Wire a collected bound volume of Donald Trump's tweets.
I own a very comical book, The Collected Poems of Donald J. Trump, available for purchase at the Daily Wire website, by the way, which compiles his most memorable tweets and declarations from 2009 to 2019 into beautiful library edition hardback form. It is a ridiculously funny tome.
Or Eric Weinstein complaining on X about how his phone hasn't rung. Nobody's serious about solving the problems because they haven't called him up, right? And it's embarrassing. It feels embarrassing, but it doesn't stop them from being regarded as deep philosophical people. It's they are immune from the things that normally would be regarded as too cringy.
Like if you had a friend like that in normal everyday life, you'd think they were the most incredibly cringe, socially awkward person, whatever. But somehow they get a pass. Like somehow that's regarded as normal.
Lex Fridman.
Yeah, Lex Fridman. I mean, look, I might just add a rider to that because that's my last one, and then I'm out. Because it's kind of related, Chris, which is that moral grandstanding, like absolutely flagrant, self-aggrandizing, usually saccharine type sentiments, where the very obvious ultra, like Lex Fridman, right? The ultra clear subtext and the whole intent of the thing that they're saying is just to signal what a wonderful person they are. They just have the absolute best of intentions. They're just trying to save the world. They're trying to increase the aggregate amount of love in the world. And they've suffered. They've suffered like Christ on the cross because they're just trying so fucking hard to do good. I mean, I don't believe it, right? It's bullshit, but people eat it up. So I find that amazing. And I think it's a superpower to be immune to cringe because it enables you to do stuff like that.
That tenant media thing was the biggest. Even if it was the case that I genuinely fell for something like that, like it would make me step back and reevaluate. I would be so paranoid about my environment where, let's say that it was the case that I got paid by another country and I genuinely had no idea that money was coming to me. I would be thinking so much, okay, hold on. This country is literally like an enemy to my country. And I know the leader doesn't like my country. And I was, even without knowing, I just happened to be saying so many good things that they found it necessary to funnel $5 million to me. Like, holy shit, I would have to reevaluate so much of my message, of the things that I say, of who the fuck around me is fucking compromised. Like, where am I even getting my news from? $5 million is a lot of fucking money. Even for Timmy, that's a lot of fucking money to get. But the fact that that's just done with no self-reflection at all. In 2 weeks, he's like, hey guys, just, I have to close all my other shows because, they're not profitable. Like, that's beyond insanity to me. And then to have the lack of self-awareness to call other people paid enemies on Twitter and shit. Like, I almost am at the point to where I can respect him for it because I'm just waiting for him to tweet out where Tim Pool is like, guys, like, this was a fucking troll. I had no clue that the MAGA shit was this morally bankrupt and this intellectually deficit. And I was just like fucking trolling the whole time. Like, you guys are fucking unhinged. I was seeing how far I could go with it. I thought the Russia shit would be the end, but it's unbelievable to me.
I felt this in a different wing, Matt, like not to that level. It's definitely not on that level, but just to say that, like, Taylor Lorenz, the kind of left-wing journalist, was very vocal about like the dangers of stochastic terrorism, like praising violence because it might motivate people to take actions, right? And there were lots of articles read about it. The definition is very clear to see. And then when Luigi Mangione shut the CEO, she was posting up, the other CEOs of companies, and suddenly the concerns about stochastic terrorism are irrelevant. It's a bit more related to shameless hypocrisy, but it's that kind of thing where I'm often like, but if you knew that you had read that and you reeled against this practice, like with Tim Pool reeling against, people being bought off or like, enemies against the US or whatever, and then you engage in it, like, don't you feel somewhere that there's a hypocrisy? But it seems not.
Well, the thing that hurts me is when there's this huge disconnect between the behavior, like what's clearly the priorities in terms of what they actually do, and these professed elevated sentiments. So, like, I don't mind people moral grandstanding that much, I suppose, and being holier than thou and so on. We saw it, except when there's a huge disconnect between, like, what you actually do. Our influencers like Lex Fridman or, well, all of the rest of them really, clearly are mainly focused on metrics, clearly focused on getting as big an audience as possible and basically making a lot of money. But their professed motivations supposedly has nothing to do with that. It's supposedly about saving the fucking world.
Yeah, we are using our sense-making apparatus to, have a good logical connection with the world, and we happen to be bringing on the exact same 15 influencer types. The Brett Weinsteins, all these guys, the Erics or whatever. All these. It's crazy that they're all making the exact same rounds. Weird how that, and they all have the same message, and it all happens to be completely and totally ideologically congruent with everything that was said before. It's so crazy how that happens,
Yeah.
We talked about it, like, people adopting a wounded bird pose that, I'm willing to take the slings and arrows because I care so much about peace in the Middle East and Ukraine that, people will say that I'm just out for myself, but I can take it. I can do it for you.
Yeah.
Well, we are approaching the 2-hour mark. We realize it's getting late for you. So we have one last little thing to round off, which I think is worthwhile. But is there any last technique that we haven't mentioned that you wanted to reference before we come to our end?
I mean, I have just so many of them. The deaf preacher is when you refuse to engage with an argument and you just make like these huge moral claims every time. I've got moral dodgeball is when accusing someone of holding different core values simply because you disagree with an applied position. Oh, so one guy might say, oh, I don't know if I agree with, this particular vaccine. And, the other guy might say that he does, but he like accuses you of being like authoritarian. Like he doesn't even want to engage with the arguments. It's just because you have a position, he agrees that you must be evil. Yeah, I've got like so many of these, but yeah, I mean, death by 1,000 anecdotes. A person will have a story for fucking everything.
God.
Do this over and over and over again. Tragedy of the common sense. Whenever somebody invokes common sense, is almost always stupid. Analogy allergy is when you, for some reason, when it comes to like a completely reasonable hypothetical, you can't engage with it because you understand that the hypothetical is going to illustrate your position as being absurd every single time. So you're all of a sudden like, oh my God, this will be the thing that I'm done. Whenever somebody says, whenever you go to compare something, right? Oh, you think it's okay to kill people because they're black. What if I said it was okay to, like run people over just because they were women? And somebody will go, that's not the same thing. And it's like, no shit, it's not the same thing, you fucking moron. It's a comparison. Why would I compare the same thing? Of course they're two different things. That's why I'm comparing them, to illustrate a point. That thing of like, oh, it's not the same. And because they know that if they entertain any analogy whatsoever, their argument falls apart and they can't comprehend any hypothetical whatsoever. That drives me insane. I guess that'd be my last one.
The flip side of that is that, like, exactly what some of the things that you said, like Jordan Peterson with Dawkins was like, I just need to tell this story. It'll take about 5 minutes. And I was like, my God, like that's just very rude as well.
This is a very difficult story to account for. It's going to take me about 5 minutes because it's complicated, but there's no way around it, I don't think.
There's the flip side of it, which is like argument via analogy. Like all you do is make this really long analogy and then present it like that has proven the point, but all you've done is like compared something to a boat.
I just head that off. If it's a conversation topic and we both understand, I'll just like, no. They'll be like, well, let me compare this or use an analogy. Like, no, don't use an analogy. Let's just talk about this. We don't need an analogy here. We both know what we're talking about. I'll just like, don't do that. Yeah.
So the last thing then, the way that Matt and I talked about that might be fair. We've spent like 2 hours shitting on everybody and everything that they do, a little bit on the, specific examples related to stuff that we've produced as well. But we know the tactics, what people do, but we also know that we are capable of using like rhetorical techniques, right? And we thought it might be good to like self-reflectively look at, are there any things that you do or that we do where like we kind of know that we're doing something like, that it might be rhetorical nature. I could give an example.
Maybe just one, and we'll just do one each. You don't have to do a full mea culpa, but we definitely realized that there's at least one thing that I remember us doing.
Okay, maybe yours is different, Matt. So maybe we'll have two. But the one I know is because me and Matt are like record the podcast with two people, right? There's this dynamic where if one of us makes a point which is too strong or too cruel, the other one can present the counter argument of like, well, hold on. So would you say that? And it gives the other person the chance to like say, well, no, I'm not arguing. Of course, that's right. There are legitimate points, right? And on the one hand, if you take it like, in the Omega rule way, it is you're acknowledging that there are issues with your position and you're not arguing for the extreme one. You're clarifying. But on the other hand, it is allowing the person to simultaneously make like a strong argument and then include the weaker deflection like they've addressed it. So it means if somebody else brings it up, you say, oh yeah, well, Matt addressed that point. So it's kind of useful in our case to have like me and Matt here. And like I say, you can view it as legitimate or you can view it as strategically useful.
All right. Well, I'll give you a chance to think, Destiny, and I'll give mine. I guess it's kind of related, Chris, but it's kind of like pre-budding. So like when you're saying something and it's going to be maybe a bit controversial, some people will react badly to that. You can say, and, in response to that, some people will say, and you kind of mention the arguments against, but that's kind of all you need to do. and that kind of diffuses the any pent-up feelings that people might be having. I think that's something.
Because you've represented their criticism?
You've represented it. Yeah, you've said it. So it's kind of okay. Yeah, it hasn't actually been properly, you haven't rebutted yourself. But you've mentioned that rebuttals are available, and it kind of nullifies them. Yeah.
I think the biggest thing that I did, and maybe I still make mistakes on this, this is something I've tried so hard over the last couple of years, is trying to match the conviction with the level of information or knowledge you have about a particular thing. And I find that if you just do that, it actually saves you from so much trouble. But I still have an issue. I think sometimes my intonation won't match the level of conviction that I have on a topic. So something might come up about Soylent, and I might say, like, Soylent it's obviously it's fucking healthy for you. Okay. It's the best thing ever. Like, if you don't agree with this, you're fucking dumb. I can't believe you don't know this. And then somebody might challenge me later on this, and they'll be like, hold on, you said that Soylent is the best thing ever. I'm like, yeah, but like, admittedly, I don't have much. That's like a 20% confidence thing. I don't actually know that 100%. It's like, okay, well, so intellectually you're appropriately grading your conviction, but the intonation that you gave sold that idea that you had like 95% confidence. That's probably the biggest thing. But yeah, I try to hedge a lot against this now, because I realize that conviction is usually where you get most in trouble. So if somebody asks me a thing, I'm like, I don't really know. Like, if somebody's like, what do you think about the death penalty? Like, I'm like pro death penalty, but I'm like 51-49. Like, I could be argued the other way. I don't have like super strong feelings on it. I feel like that's the most important thing you can do.
I feel like the influencer dynamics are kind of like, that's, the people are pushed in the way of giving confident answers, because when they're hedging, it kind of reflects like lack of certainty or that kind of thing. But what about Destiny in the case where, like, because you engage in, the heated debates with red pill people, and not so much because they're not so fond of doing that, I think, at the minute. But in those conversations, people are doing lots of even much more extreme things than we're talking about here, like intentional bad faith representations or being insulting. So if things go that way, do you have like emergency cord that you can pull to, like, that is like, it's a way to win a debate or to, get time to rebut things, but it's like, it's a kind of bad faith strategy in another circumstance?
I think the most bad faith way to rebut people is when you know the counter. Like, if you're arguing a thing that you feel passionate about, you should always know the counter arguments a lot. I don't know the counter arguments in depth to anything. I guess you can say there are times where I will give what I know there's a knockdown argument to this. But I just won't say, because I'm curious if the other person knows it. But my audience will know it, and I'll usually go over it at the end. There's a lot of this with Israel-Palestine. They say that the Palestinians don't have control of the West Bank. You do know that, like, the Palestinian Authority is literally authorized by, Oslo I, strengthened a bit by Oslo II, that the Palestinian Authority completely runs the West Bank, and that's the PLO, right? And chances are it's Israel-Palestine, nobody knows anything, right? And I know there are counter arguments to that they're seen as a security contractor for Israel, that a lot of Palestinians aren't like. But I won't say that. You don't know it. Well, fuck you. But I'll try to say it at the end to my audience, like, okay, listen, there are counter arguments to this. The person just didn't know it. So yeah, you could either start doing that, pulling out arguments that there are knockdowns to, but the other person won't. The second thing, this is the really bad faith debate bro thing, and I usually don't ever do this anymore, but it's when you've lost a debate, so you enter philosophy mode and you just try to like spot contradiction in the enemy argument without ever putting forth any of your own, because you know that they won't be logically consistent in everything, even though you can't like refute the actual narrative. So you just try to like basically nitpick everything. But yeah, or just calling people names. If somebody wants to like get like down in the mud, I love that. I'll do that. That's super. Do that with Honor Troyer or so.
We are not above calling people names either on Decoding the Gurus. That's okay.
Not necessarily to the level that Destiny might invoke in regards to people's mullers and not. We usually leave them out of things.
Leave the mothers alone, Destiny. Come on.
The streamer world is a dark and dangerous place. But well, this has been enjoyable. I think it worked with there is a lot of crossover, and maybe. Like for me, the part of the difference is people on our side maybe are a little bit more trying to present themselves as like scientific, rigorous thinkers, like, kind of
authorities.
Yeah, authorities. I know that there are people in your space doing that, but they also seem to be, just polemical at times and that kind of thing. So
yeah. Our spaces are clashing though, because all of your gurus are all becoming fucking Trump and MAGA sycophants. So the worlds are colliding, Yeah.
Even I will say, just as a warning, that even the people that are on the perhaps would be seen as more legitimate fringe, like Andrew Huberman, I think many people would have regarded after the election. He started tweeting about the issues with science. He's announced that he's going to do a series on vaccines when he never once did an episode on vaccines during the entire pandemic. And, he is somebody that, to Joe Rogan's face, said that he watched Joe Rogan's comedy 3 or 4 times in the space of a week because it was so good. So you see in the MAGA era that even the people that were like a little bit more on the like towards the legitimate, or at least not pandering directly to MAGA, that seems to be coming up much more clearly now. So there is
the cult is insane. Remember for Bushisms, like even conservatives kind of laughed at Bushisms. Now you've got people unironically doing the fucking Trump dance. It's so fucking cringe. It's like he can do no wrong. It's so dumb. Ugh.
Well, you have a question that you often mention about like when you're talking with MAGA or faux centrists about like what are their, do they have something that they really strongly disagree with Trump on? And from what I've seen, that works because the things that they mention are always like, you know, very incidental or like very mild critiques. But like if you ask any liberal, do you have critiques of Kamala Harris? Like it's a litany,
half of them will say, I
right?
didn't even fucking vote for it. Yeah, Jesus. Yeah.
Oh yeah. That's it. Well,
All right. Well,
thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Destiny. The great coalescing is happening. All the gurus are linking up and streamers and influencers and all that shit. So we'll probably do this again sometime. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Have a good one.